Hello and welcome to the Suppression of the Jesuits. It may be said with some truth that this order alone has contributed more than all the other orders together to confirm the wavering nations in the faith of Rome, to support the tottering authority of the High Pontiff, to check the progress of the Protestant Reformation, and to make amends for the losses their Holiness has sustained in Europe by propagating the gospel, and with it a blind submission to the Holy See among the African, American, and Indian infidels. Archibald Bower wrote that in his History of the Popes in 1766. So it should come as a surprise to people listening that in 7 years the Pope would suppress this order, which had been so unwavering in its commitment to the Pope. It was certainly a tragedy for the Catholic Church, and it provides a great what if on the eve of the French Revolution. It was certainly the belief of Catholic converts in the 19th century, such as Karl Ludwig von Haller, and Catholic apologists like Joseph de Maistre, the author of The Pope, that the forces of Catholic tradition were decimated by this unforced error on the part of Europe's royalty, a fact that was vindicated when the order was restored under Pius VII in 1814, following Napoleon's first abdication. Last year, I said this about the Jesuits, the first Jesuit order, the order before 1814, the subject of today's discussion. They, the Jesuits, were men possessed of the courage of the conquistadors. By that, I was essentially referencing figures like Ignatius of Loyola, who was a soldier, Francis Xavier in his exploration of the Far East, the two co-founders of the Society of Jesus, but also referring to the martyrs like Southwell during the reign of Elizabeth. Aristotelian intellectual rigor and an anti-Machiavel sense of realpolitik. Aristotelian intellectual rigor in the sense that as humanists and in following the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, they were very much attempting to find various synergies between pre-Christian modes of thought, such as Confucianism, in some cases elements of Buddhist teaching and philosophy in Japan and elsewhere throughout the world, with stringent defense of Catholic orthodoxy. And what I mean by anti-Machiavel is that Machiavel, again, has been typecast as this origin for political realism and amorality in terms of political analysis. I don't personally believe that, but that is very much the perception. The anti-Machiavel, funny enough, in terms of how this will relate back to the end of this conversation, was actually a treatise penned by none other than the great Protestant king of Prussia, Frederick II the Great. But what it represents essentially is that there is a way of conducting realpolitik, as the Jesuits were, consummate diplomats, appealing to the political centers of whatever region or power they encountered, and attempting to appeal for the leaders themselves to convert their populations, rather than acting as these great religious revolutionaries trying to incite the masses to rebellion from below. They were the first global perennialists while remaining devout Christians. And when I refer to perennialists, again, finding a synergy in the civilizational modes and discussions and philosophies with the Catholic tradition, which is now being exposed to them. In this way, you can see the Jesuits as harbingers of a new intellectual horizon for Catholicism, the discovery of the New World, and the fact that Protestantism, by the time of the foundation of the Society of Jesus in 1540, was a force to stay, and from the point of view of the Jesuits, a force they had to forever contend with. Indeed, I've focused on many topics in the previous streams on this channel. If you go back and watch those streams, you will actually find a through line in some way connecting all of these disparate topics. One of these topics is of the Greek concept of homonoia, the unity of mankind, and how I believe, in a sense, that actually links to the Jesuit perception of being apostles to the entire world, their conversion, their evangelical mission to preach and explore and expand the horizons of what was possible in terms of conversions at that time, all the way from the southern sort of tip of South America to Japan. You can almost, in terms of finding analogies for understanding what the sort of Jesuit ambition for the world was, it's almost like the empire of Cyrus the Great of Persia, but if you imagine the Pope as Cyrus. And if there is a Jesuit golden age, which epitomizes, you can say, all of these lofty aspirations for the order, it was during the period after the Tridentine Reform, from 1540, the foundation of the order, up until 1615, which represented the death of Superior General Aquaviva, who was in many cases responsible for what has been called the second founding of the order, which is a great revival in Jesuit education. And it is also in the field of education for which I want to turn this. Because trying to understand the downfall, the first political downfall of the Jesuits, you can attest to it right from the moment of its foundation. Because during a period when, say, for example, with the French fighting their wars against the Habsburgs, the Jesuits were reflective of a medieval idea which, again, I've commented on significantly, which is this notion of the res publica Christiana, all of the Catholic and indeed Christian monarchies across the world owing deference to something which is greater than any individual nation state, the unity of Christendom as a whole. Hence why I relate back to this whole idea of the Greek word unity of mankind, homonoia. So you can see the Jesuits, say, for example, attaching themselves to the Catholic League in France, which was very much a partisan force in many ways for the King of Spain, not just in terms of trying to advocate for the cause of the French monarchy as a whole. So that's one aspect. But you can also say that the Jesuits served as a bulwark, more broadly, against what was evolving out of the political situation in Europe in the 17th century, which was Hobbesian absolutism, the idea that the king has to be the supreme authority, in some instances, the supreme authority to mediate religious disputes, and in some cases, the authority to impose a uniform religion upon his subjects, as was the case with the Catholic King Louis XIV, with his Edict of Fontainebleau, which revoked many of the privileges the Protestants had then enjoyed for 100 years. So, as a vehicle for the unity of Christendom, you would say that the Jesuits seemingly were increasingly out of step with the development of history. As far as I'm concerned, they were this medieval throwback. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I think it's fascinating that there is the continuation of this trend going back from the Gregorian Reform and the Reform movement in general, the papacy during the medieval era, throughout this period up until the French Revolution. So if you're going to look at the downfall for the Jesuits, I see a tragic irony for the Jesuits in terms of the fact that they represented a scientific and educational tradition. But by the time of the 18th century, we see the devolution of the whole notion of science into science versus religion. In other words, there is now a dialectic which has been formed as a result, say, for example, of the incident with Galileo in the 17th century, in which the Jesuits themselves played a part. And with figures like Voltaire in the 18th century, it appears as if religion and science in the minds of polemicists have become irreconcilable forces, despite the fact, again, that the Jesuits were responsible for exposing and innovating in so much of, I would say, almost the precursors to sociology and the comparative history of religions, etc., etc. So by the 17th and the 18th centuries, again, the Jesuits almost seem to have provided the impetus. They were the forerunners for many of the critics of the church, taking their research and the intellectual impetus. I mean, people look at Voltaire and say he is a great historian because he was the historian who was able to take the Eurocentric view, essentially, ostensibly, associated with historians at the time, and broaden it to include the entire world. Of course, his entire sort of legacy in that part is the legacy of the Jesuits, which he simply attached himself to. So another aspect you can look at in terms of the destruction of the Jesuits is the fact that it was an overreach of something called Enlightened absolutism, whereby all of these monarchs in the vein of a Voltaire would look at the church as a bastion of superstition and outmoded practices in general, not just simply as being a great holder of wealth and political and monastic establishments throughout various European empires. So you can almost see that what Enlightened absolutism wanted to achieve in the 18th century was not just reducing the power of the Jesuits, but seizing their property. You can look at this as a Henry VIII scenario taking place across the entire world, far grander in scope, and of course, bringing back various comparisons with the Knights Templar, where you can say that the primary motivation for the dissolution of the Knights Templar in the 14th century was exactly that, attempting to decimate a rival system of power and appropriate its assets, whilst also trying to morally and intellectually denigrate it. And you can almost say that when I say the overreach of Enlightened absolutism, in terms of trying to consolidate the power of the state, the monarchy, against all of these other forces, nothing is so sort of represented in terms of the buyer's remorse for this idea than the fact you have great enlightened despots like Leopold II of Austria and Catherine the Great having such a dramatic ideological about turn when they're faced with the French Revolution in 1789. So the failure of the Jesuits represents the failure of the devout idea, the ideas that were still present at the beginning of the 18th century, which was to transcend the idea of individual nation states and look at the unity of Christendom. The failure of monism and ultramonism, the idea that the Pope should retain his position of spiritual supremacy and confirm the idea of papal infallibility. The idea of the state triumphing over the ecclesiastical structures of Europe and the world. We're not simply talking about places like Spain and France and Portugal and Austria. We're also talking about very specific hubs of Jesuit activity like Paraguay and like Brazil. And confirming what I was saying earlier, the triumph of science as science versus religion, the triumph of that dialectic, and we are still in the throes of that dialectic even today. So I want to begin this conversation in terms of the reading by looking into the history of Jesuit education and how in many ways, again, right from the beginning, this can serve as an example of disfavor for the Jesuits in terms of the accusations labeled against them. This book is Dale Van Kley's The Origins of the French Revolution, one that I'm going to be referencing, and no doubt in various other streams. At their best, as in the case of Edmond Auger, a Jesuit sermon was an artful exercise in classical rhetoric and hence humanistic in a curricular sense in terms of education. That humanism, moreover, had been more at home among urban elites and princely courts since the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. Finally, the Jesuits were also a missionary order, and classically lettered missionaries were eventually to make ideal agents of the colonizing monarchy's attempt to spread French civilization in North America. This is taken from the perspective of a book written specifically about the French Revolution, but you can see this being evident with Portugal and with Spain in particular. Just a note, if you do hear a strange noise in the background, I'm afraid I have to have my fan on for this stream. I will otherwise expire and I won't be able to think or function because it is very hot at the time of me saying all of this. But emphasis on humanism, this is a trajectory that the church has really been encountering since the end of the 13th century, really the beginning of the 14th century. Indeed, I was just, as many of you will know, completing a stream a few days ago talking about Kantorowicz's views on Dante. And if you take Kantorowicz's viewpoint regarding Dante's political philosophy, he very clearly situates the beginning of Renaissance humanism with a figure like Dante. So in many ways, the Jesuits are actually continuing on in, I would say, the tradition of Dante, but thoroughly inverted to replace the figure of the emperor with the figure of the Pope. Again, it seems to be this Dantean expression of the Guelph idea, if I'm going to be pretentious, which I often am, unfortunately, on this channel, unintentionally. It's just things that pop into my head here and there. The Jesuits' humanism was civic or active rather than contemplative, taking the world as their cloister and committing themselves to a service-oriented or public apostolate. The emphasis on activity, in combination with the society's cultivation of rhetoric and missionary zeal, produced a humanism of a more philosophical stripe, expressing itself as a bias in favor of the human condition generally, and especially in defense of the free human will. And again, if you looked at my presentation on Dante, all of these elements again were fully in evidence there. This bent received further encouragement as a result of the Jesuits' apologetic efforts against Protestantism, another of their specialities, and in reaction to the denial of free will implicit in the doctrine of the justification by faith alone, the sola fide, which is a core component of Lutheran belief. In theological parlance, the Jesuits displayed neo-Pelagian tendencies. That is, they tended to minimize human corruption and the natural effects of the first man's fall, stressing rather humanity's residual goodness and its still intact freedom of will. For the Jesuit, Louis Richon, for example, writing under the reign of Henry IV, so this is the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, the human's body's mobile hand was a true portrait of free will and a truly seigneurial liberty, which they mean noble liberty, which not even God's forces, lest he destroy his own image and make the will no will at all by means of the divine faculty. Richelieu optimistically argued human nature might become even more wise and perfect without terminus or end. Indeed, even the remains of original sin were only so many occasions for the virtuous to be tested, and spurs for the honourable to win greater glory. A noble and brave heart gets bored, he thought, if it does not have some reason to exercise itself. So this was a theology orientated towards you can almost say a trans-theological, a non-theoretical idea of Christian optimism, which readily recognized the divine everywhere in nature, and most especially in human nature. This outlook held not only for human reason, but as for the will indeed, even for physical beauties and passions. The devout humanistic universe was therefore one in which, as the Jesuit Pierre Lemont put it, the inferior beauties are on degrees by which it is necessary for human love to ascend foot by foot until it arrives at the enjoyment of sovereign beauty. Now, reading that, you can also place that the main adversaries for the Jesuits in this conversation are regarding the conflict between the more orthodox Dominicans and the view of the lackadaisical and rather relativistic Jesuits. So you can take this and say that this is part of an indication towards Jesuitical thinking, which has many different insinuations are sort of born out of the idea of Jesuitical thinking. The one is making wordplay in order to justify heterodox, heretical positions, often appealing to philosophical jargon. The other aspect of Jesuitical thinking is this idea that the Jesuit is always concealing his true intentions. He is always revealing aspects of falsehood. And this isn't just a spiritual accusation against the Jesuits. This is also a political accusation against the Jesuits. Indeed, this whole admonition of Jesuitical thinking is exactly that which, say, for example, helped justify the atmosphere of complete hostility in Japan towards Catholicism for 200 years. But you look at that, and you take a broader view, and what that passage was saying regarding this optimistic view on humanity, and it's almost as if one can interpret from that point of view that they take a more academic approach to the topic of sin. If you de-emphasize the rotten state of mankind and the fallen state of mankind, and as I was explaining with Cantoris's view on Dante last time, the perfectibility of man as some sort of, greater philosophical animal who can appeal to greater sort of pagan virtues, albeit always subordinated to Christian virtues, then this can lead to an even sort of greater intellectual antipathy from organizations like the Dominicans But these accusations, and the Jesuits throughout their history will have to make so many quote unquote humble remonstrances in order to protect themselves from slander. But in terms of the most obvious aspects of targeting the Jesuits for their, again, role when it comes to things like their lackadaisical views on sin, we come to the views on Jesuits and their, you can say, sexual permissive, for some reason I can't say that word, their attitudes towards being permissive when it comes to again, acts that other sort of Catholics would find abhorrent. This in particular is a segment taken from Jonathon Wright's book, The Warriors of Christ. Jesuits, what they were, one critic asked, were men who frequented the brothels themselves, kept mistresses for their pleasure, and became epicures in sensuality, men who have finally managed to slake their own sexual thirsts, found time to pimp for their fellow Catholics. No pander that ever Terence or Plautus mentioned in their comedies was so nimble at the trade of winning pretty wenches as the Jesuits of this day. Hence, again, the appeal to beauty and optimism. If you try and take this idea of seigneurial liberty, noble liberty, and pervert it into being libertine, into being licentious, then you have the accusations directed at the Jesuits in this manner. This was myth-making at its sordid, and that's Jonathon Wright's opinion, not mine, albeit I would concur with him in this instance. Mendacious at worst, but myth-making with a habit of captivating audiences. Indeed, this is a ditty from the 1730s. Priests, whether Jesuits or friars, are pious cheats, religious liars, who use their function as a gin to catch unwary maids in. And this was a segment taken from The Wanton Jesuit. A Jesuit is a clever man. When a maid comes to confusion, he first does absolve and next trespass, and brings her to oppression. Then he kisses and does all he can to multiply transgression. The insinuation being that the Jesuits were of the opinion that it is fine to sin because the greater the sin can lead to the greater aspects of redemption, and indeed the need of their services in order to offer absolution. If you again compare this to the dissolution of the Templars, again carried out in part by the French monarchy and as a European-wide movement of state-directed moral furor in order to abolish a religious institution, the accusations of heresy and spitting on the crucifix and denying Christ weren't enough. There had to be accusations of prolific sodomy in order to thoroughly and utterly destroy the reputation of the Jesuits. And indeed, as slander was so important in terms of propagating the myth to destroy the Knights Templar in memory, such as the case with the Jesuits at that time. So here we come to a slightly, again, more elevated reading of this topic, which is looking at Jesuit sort of intellectual struggle itself through the figure of Cardinal Bellarmine, who was one of these great archetypal Jesuit figures at the turn of the 17th century. And this segment again is taken from Wright. The Catholic Church faced a conundrum. The fact that the Jesuits had been such a spectacular success was the very reason why many Catholics began to question their motives. A spectacular success, and again, in the sense that they were now missionaries to the entire world and the world Catholic empires. The choice was between the Society of Jesus, redoubtable champion of Counter-Reformation, supposedly encapsulated by the martyrdoms of James Sall, and many other sort of martyrdoms are iterated here throughout this case. It's not just, when I again speak to the courage and the conquistador spirit, it's the willingness to go over to all of the places of the world, invariably hostile environments, preach, whilst also, like I said, observing this spirit of realpolitik by attempting to use the monarchies they find at the time, whether the Chinese emperor or a Japanese lord in order to do the conversion for them, in order to spare them any direct risk to their persons, but inevitably there are a great series of martyrdoms. The Society of Jesus, portrayed by some Catholic commentators as arrogant, grasping, disruptive, made up of men who, according to one story from the 17th century in France, refused to join the daily round of church ritual because the pride of their hearts will not suffer them to go into procession with the meaner orders. And again, as we actually saw with the Templars again, I think it's just important to bring back those comparisons, because I believe the situation is almost unprecedented in terms of finding a closer comparison than the Templars and the Jesuits, with the main exception, of course, being that the Jesuits weren't literal conquistadors in the sense that they were monastic warriors, but nevertheless, the emphasis is that with the Templars and the Jesuits, they were able, again, unintentionally perhaps, to establish a greater level of interdenominational rivalry between the other Catholic orders, and that led to their downfall and the willing encouragement of, whether it be the Hospitallers in the case of the Templars or the Dominicans in the case of the Jesuits, to celebrate the dissolution of the order. In September of 1621, Robert Bellarmine, Jesuit and reluctant cardinal, died at Rome. His muddled reputation does an excellent job of summing up a schizophrenic Catholic attitude towards Loyola's new society, that being St. Ignatius. Bellarmine had written eloquently about the art of dying well, an art that obsessed early modern Europeans like few others, but from the outset, it was his posthumous career as a miracle maker and saintly intercessor that seemed uppermost in many people's minds. Francis Xavier, who had arrived at Goa in the very year of Bellarmine's birth, was not, it seems, the only Jesuit able to inspire gruesome acts of devotion. If we are to believe one contemporary account, many were present with towels, handkerchiefs, sponges, and other linen to save the blood and preserve it for relics. Although one of his physicians, in lieu of reward, cut away a little piece of the hinder part of the skull, his 3 medical colleagues were already provided for, since earlier in the course of the cardinal's sickness they had secured a supply of the blood obtained by bloodletting and leeching. Once on display, Bellarmine's corpse had apparently needed bodyguards to prevent the crowds from kissing and mauling his face, permitting them only his hands and feet. Nonetheless, some individuals managed to make away with pieces of his mitre, tassels from his cardinal's hat, and the skirts of his vestments. It was a wise and pious kind of theft, since only a short while after his death, cloth that had merely been touched by the cardinal's body was reported to be capable of healing broken bones. Of course, this is a rich tradition in terms of the whole idea of the Catholic reliquary, holding certain artifacts which were held on to saints. The most, by far, I would say, the most prominent example of this is the Shroud of Turin. Here, then, was the Society of Jesus being cherished and adored. Bellarmine may not have faced the perils of persecution and martyrdom like Cottam, Sellers, or Southwell, these are being the Elizabethan martyrs, but he had still done as much as any of his contemporaries in the battle against the heirs of Luther and Calvin. Back in 1588, an excellent year with armadas and such for insulting Catholics, William Whitaker had remembered how, with the onset of the Reformation, the clear and cheerful lustre of the gospel had illuminated with its rays some portions of the Christian world, and black, deadly, baneful, and tedious night of popish superstition had seemingly been vanquished. But then, on a sudden, the Jesuits sprang up to obscure, with pestilential vapours, and ravish from our view the light so hateful to themselves, and amongst these locusts, Whitaker calculated, none had done so quite so much mischief as Robert Bellarmine, a native of Italy. Bellarmine looked very much like an invincible champion, as one with whom none of our men would dare to engage, who nobody can answer, and whom, if anyone should hope to conquer, they would regard him as an utter madman. Again, just reiterating the fact that the Jesuits are born out of the Tridentine Reformation. They are born with this combative, martial spirit, not simply to expand to non-Christians, but to fight that interdenominational war between the Catholic Church and the Protestants. In print, in the pulpit, as the theology professor in Rome, Bellarmine had moulded a sophisticated, expansive defense of Catholic doctrine and ritual. the fact that he had done so much with so much politeness, resisting and the insulting ad hominem attacks so fashionable among his peers, hardly lessened his reputation, as to borrow the phrase of one Protestant critic, the grand master of the controversies. But there was more to Bellarmine than this. Aspects of his reputation that were rather unsettling. An enviable reputation for generosity, holiness, and austerity melded with the fact that his theorizing about the temporal power of the Pope, the right to intervene in secular affairs, had offended many Catholics, Jesuits among them, and earned him a place on the index of forbidden books. He had been embroiled in the cosmological chaos of the Galileo affair. He had irritated English Catholics for his pamphlet war with James I. He had infuriated Venetian Catholics by criticizing their attitude toward papal authority. He had even managed to sum up the wholesome Jesuit habit of getting involved in the political struggles of 16th century France. Having made it through an ambush en route to the city, he and his Jesuit retinue survived the siege of Paris in 1590. This during the height of, or the aftermath really, of the War of the Three Henries, which was perhaps the bloodiest period of the French Wars of Religion, only by virtue of a horse haunch given them to eat by the Spanish ambassador. Much of the city's population had been reduced to a diet of cats and dogs. It would always be possible for Catholics to tailor their selections from this extraordinary career. Supporters, the reputation would pursue the canonization of Robert Bellarmine for more than 3 centuries. It took 3 centuries because others did not see the saint in him. But what Bellarmine's life and legacy made abundantly clear is that there has been much the Jesuits' first century than the plaudit-winning business of countering Reformation. In the words of education, science, politics, and global evangelism, an innovative, ambitious, multinational organization, of which the prolific Bellarmine was surely the quintessence, had made spectacular advances, and it was precisely this vigor and versatility that managed to delight and disrupt the Catholic world in roughly equal measure. That segment, I think, is a brilliant exposition, essentially, as to what the Jesuits were representative of at the time of Bellarmine's death in 1621. But again, emphasis on the controversial aspects revolving around the science and the scientific controversies of Galileo, and indeed the role between the Jesuit and the proper deference to local authority. And you can again understand that this is a serious issue. Why should the Jesuits, who are being, you can say, court followers of the Ming dynasty in China, who aren't basically trying to use everything at their disposal in terms of trying to win more converts, perhaps even inciting religious strife and civil war, why should they take a much harder stance when it comes to local Catholic rulers than they do with what they basically consider to be foreign infidels? If you look at the complicated, as I refer to, the anti-Machiavel realpolitik of the Jesuits, then it just lends itself to infinite accusations. And the minute, of course, the Jesuits become embroiled in a struggle like the Jesuits become involved in a struggle like the the French Wars of Religion, then there is this conflict between them being partisans for the Spanish, partisans for the Pope, or indeed partisans for the French king. All of these controversies will haunt them throughout their entire history, it should be mentioned. And this is where we get to a rather interesting article I found regarding the sort of main theme I wanted to sort of touch upon, which is the Jesuits as being the victims of this Enlightenment despotism, this idea that enthralled the monarchies and really, you should say, the state machineries of the 18th century, which was to do what Henry VIII did, but again, under a different god, no longer the idea of separating from the Church in Rome in order to establish the Church of England, but in order basically to create some sort of synergy between a Church of Reason and the old Catholic Church, so long as it can basically support the power of the monarchy. And this is Alfaro's The Jesuits and Enlightened Despotism. And Alfaro is a Mexican historian and evidently a Jesuit apologist, which makes sort of dissecting this article rather interesting. And again, I will have to emphasize that even though this is a translation, and the fact that this article has been translated in and of itself is an interesting fact, His prose is very dramatic, I think is the nice way of putting it. At the time of foundation, the most advanced of the exploring nations was also the first to recognize the potential of this young institute and to take advantage of the Jesuits' enterprising spirit to support the expansion of its empire, these being the Portuguese in particular. 2 centuries later, Lisbon's erudite cabinet, converted into the champion of a radical modernity, would also be the first to realize how irksome this religious organization could be to the crown, that aspired to operate under new rules in an attempt to emulate the prosperous northern European powers of England and the Netherlands. And indeed, looking at the connection between, again, England and Henry VIII as some sort of forerunner for what happens in the 18th century isn't spurious. The victories of England in the 18th century, I believe, have a greater knock-on effect than people realize on Catholic Europe. Since the 16th century, the Society of Jesus have been trying to construct within the Church a synthesis between the age-old tradition of Western Christianity and Renaissance humanism. But the world was transformed to such a degree that some of the social and political structures that had functioned well for a millennium became less and less effective when faced with the growing impotence of certain elements, industry, the burgeoning bourgeoisie, for example, and is assuming the new geopolitical realities, the decreasing importance of European cultural order in comparison to the rest of the world. During the latter half of the 18th century, a denominational definition of great social spaces, Christianity, as opposed to Islam or the pagan world, ceased to be operative. Difficulty and productive tensions defining the spheres of authority and papacy and the crowns also had to be reconfigured. I think what he's getting at in terms of the redefinition of space, cultural space, during the Golden Age, which I mentioned earlier, from 1550 up until 1615, that represents the great possibilities for the Jesuits in terms of their missionary work. They were incredibly successful in the New World, and they were far less successful in Asia. In China, they were able to gain some quite prominent converts, but by and large, Catholicism was relegated to the area around Macau, south of Canton. In India, again, the Portuguese were able to establish various outposts on the coast, but invariably outside of Goa, the presence of Catholicism was rather negligible. There is a very interesting episode regarding that, which is when Akbar was creating his sort of syncretic religion, Din-i-Ilah. This would be at the end of the 16th century. He invited Jesuits to do dialogue with Muslims and Jains and Buddhists and Hindus, and it didn't go very well. That would probably be the height of Jesuit Catholic influence in India. But in Japan, despite having started off, you can say, very successfully in terms of winning some very high-profile converts, even the prospect that Kyushu would become a great Catholic redoubt in the Far East for the for the Portuguese in particular, as some sort of, I'm not going to say shadow empire, but some sort of satellite maybe of the dual monarchy. The reaction to it in the form of Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu was so strong that the Catholics were utterly annihilated in Japan. So by the end of the 17th century and the 18th century, that missionary zeal is effectively dead. What is the Islamic world then is to remain more or less the Islamic world. And what is the pagan world and what is really meant there in terms of a 18th century outlook is the non-quote-unquote Abrahamic religions. So the Buddhists and the polytheists throughout the rest of the world. So once you realign this whole concept of space, suddenly the world, which was expanding out for the Jesuits in the 16th century, has now contracted horribly. And so you now have the Jesuits as an established fact. The Jesuits are no longer looking for avenues for adventure. The Jesuits are political functionaries, landholders, and they occupy a social and spiritual position. And if you look in terms of, say, for example, their deference towards the papal authority, then that becomes a great liability for the Jesuits. So they occupy an ever-shrinking world, or at least that's how I'm going to read this. The Church had witnessed how its sphere of influence had expanded to include all the continents, but had been reduced to only Catholic domains and their extensions created by the missionaries. The very space of the Germanic Empire was already a multi-dimensional reality. By that, he's referring to the Holy Roman Empire having it legally enshrined that it will be multi-confessional. Calvin and Calvinist and Lutheran states. Furthermore, an increasingly vigorous and autonomous reason marveled at its own achievements in the fields of science and technology and began to imagine that it would become a self-referential system, with it essentially employing many of the attributes of a new religion. Scientism, I think he's basically alluding to there. Literally a new religion, and the fact that during the French Revolution they will establish the religion of reason and many other various offshoots for that. Many of the great Enlightenment thinkers were deists. A small number of them were atheists, but prominently among them was, of course, Diderot. And I think Diderot is one of the superlative examples in the 18th century in terms of trying to create a self-referential system, what he's referring to in his encyclopedia. The end of Christianity's influence, replaced by that of civilization, was accomplished by the strengthening of nations. Reorganization of the limits of political authority was expressed through the absolutist ambition of different crowns. The rising stars of those centuries were the nation states, and like reason, they sought to become totally autonomous and even self-sufficient organisms. Why wouldn't they establish their own sacred spaces and control their own symbolic systems? Absolute reason, the absolute state, the absolute nation, these were the protagonists which, in their quest for affirmation before an ancien regime, where there was constant tension between different spheres of power, between different social societies, loyalties, and between contingency and transcendence, believed it was possible to overcome those conflicts, impose unequivocal formulas, and establish transparent and refined societies. That's quite a long sentence, but I'll try to unpack it. The absolute state, the absolute nation. This is something that actually coincides with the creation of the Jesuits. At the same time as we have the creation of the Jesuits, we have the formulation of rulers throughout Europe, and in particular in the Holy Roman Empire, being able to officiously determine the religion of his own state. And so expand that notion to Catholic nations in the 18th century, and you have an existential crisis for the Catholic Church. What he's also referring to is the fact that even in places like very Catholic Austria under Mary Theresa, the Cameralists, the great sort of advocates for political science, as it was burgeoning in the 18th century, these are people who are advocating for streamlining the organization of the state and ensuring that state functionaries are better educated, and they are again imbibing these quote-unquote enlightened rationalist principles, especially when we get to Josephism, the Emperor Joseph II of Austria. So take all of these ideas again, I believe that's really what he's referring to here. But autonomous and self-sufficient organisms, if you begin to look at the nation state as self-referential, as needing to have no greater reference point or subservience to another authority, whether it be the Christ or in the case of Jesuits, the Pope, then of course the Jesuits will be the victims of this new reality. The Society of Jesus was the first to fall victim. Many others would have a long-lasting influence. Certain brilliant minds from that time baptized it in the age of enlightenment and dreamed the dreams of reason. They imagined that the resolution of the paradoxes of knowledge, language, or the heart was within their reach, that the true parousia, or the second coming, was finally to be heralded on earth. And again, what he's clearly doing is advocating that this is all a form of religious displacement, which in many cases it was. I mean, if you're going to look at, this is something that Reinhard Koselleck talks about extensively, the idea that with the Lutheran Reformation and with the Rosicrucians, etc., during the 30 Years' War, the 30 Years' War again, which is heralding so much of what has been referred to here, many Protestant elements of what Americans will probably understand as the rapture is becoming secularized into something else, which is utopianism. Clarity would no longer be formed by those bright rays of light surrounded by darkness evoked by Athanasius Kircher, but by the perfect transparence invoked by Mozartian universe. There were some who took their fantasies further, hoping to create the paradise of the magic flute here on Earth, and to do so immediately. What he's referring to here is that the magic flute, the libretto, for some reason I'm forgetting the name of the librettist, but the libretto of magic flute is basically kind of like a Masonic religion. There are some people who were also advocating that it was mocking Masonry, but in the sense that Austria at the time of the 1780s and 1790s was encountering a difficult relationship with Masonry, should sort of lead to various, pseudo-religious fads like we see with the libretto to the magic flute, but that's what's being referred to here. They believed in an illusion that promised a paradise free of illusions. They were fervent spirits, with nevertheless advocated a serene world devoid of fanaticisms, and turned their energies against a minority that represented the weakest link in the system they wanted to dismantle, but also the most conspicuous. And by that, the most conspicuous link is, of course, the church. And the fervent spirits, these erudite advocates for enlightenment, are figures such as Immanuel Kant. But in fairness to Immanuel Kant, again, he doesn't see this as being brought about by political cataclysms or revolutions, or even, you can say, displaced utopianism, but by the gentle sort of inculcation of ideas among an increasingly sort of expanding intellectual elite. But I would argue in a tragic way that's just as idealistic, if not more so. They were either tacitly or enthusiastically supported in their efforts by numerous sincere Catholics who believed that the proposed reform simply implied a minor reorganization, that the suppression of the Society of Jesus represented just another one of the usual skirmishes between the papacy and the royal patronages, and that the object of this action was only to give the legitimate sovereigns a little more authority over a church which continued to be one of the temporal powers, and also to restabilize the ecclesiastical panorama at the cost of a seemingly omnipresent religious order. The best exhibition of this would be the Catholic patriots of Louis XIV in the 1680s and the 1690s, people who basically believed that the king should have more authority, and even, you can say, all of the assembled clergy, the conciliarists, the bishops, should have more authority vis-a-vis the Pope, and that the national church, whether it be Gallicanism or any sort of other iteration you see there, should be the way forward, as opposed to appealing again to what a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers are doing, which is this neo-medievalism, which is incarnate in the Jesuits as representing all of Christendom, as opposed to particular patriotisms of the Catholic countries. The most dynamic sectors of European society were naturally drawn to this Enlightened project. They were representatives of a struggle to achieve agricultural and industrial development, the improvement of urban spaces, educational reform, the transformation of the spheres of popular political participation. What is being referred to here, of course, is the Industrial Revolution. City planning, in particular, was a major theme of the later 18th century. Educational reform, the emphasis on taking the control of religious institutions from the church and making them state institutions. And by political participation, that means increasing political participation. The most obvious example of this during the time of the suppression of the Jesuits was, of course, the American War of Independence. But the most naive among them decided it was necessary to change the shape and hats and lengths of capes, and devoted themselves to systematically destroying the artistic heritage of previous generations, just as a number of academics, non-congregations and chapters had, and to quash any expression of cultural pluralism, after the example of New Spain's bishops Lorenzo and Fabian Eforo. Political leaders Pombal, Tanucci and Campanas could not resist the authoritarian temptation of trying to please their subjects without taking them into account. The arrogance of those who worshipped intelligence was as excessive as the sense of superiority of those who believed themselves predestined by providence. And that, again, is why the Jesuit apologetics is creeping in there. But what is essentially being referred to is a large aspect of the great sort of monastic and religious reforms, is the dissolution of monasteries throughout Catholic Europe. The different episodes that led to the suppression of the Society of Jesus may be seen as a series of isolated events, each of which might be explained as a product of the time and place in which they occurred, the unlikely measures taken by Esquilaci, the old synchronicity of the protests against the measures, the shady dealings of Father Lavalette, or the psychological frailty of Father Malagrida, added to the complex situation of the reductions, the ambiguous stance of Voltaire and the philosophes, Pombal's Aravism and animosity. What they're referring to the reductions is the particular notion of Jesuit reserves. I think in terms of our understanding of the word would be much better understood vis-a-vis reductions, because reductions has the implication that these are not what they were, which is vast, sort of sprawling religious establishments. You can almost describe them as mini statelets, and that was definitely the interpretation of the time. The social resentment and political finesse of Roda and Monino, the simplicity or astonishing clairvoyance of Charles III, Lorenzo Ricci's weakness, Clement IV's deviousness, and the inability to withstand blackmail, threats of military invasion, or even schism. But it's clear that these are not sufficient to explain the chain of events that led to an incident of planetary scope. By Charles III, he's referring to Charles III of Spain, the quote-unquote enlightened king of Spain. It is possible to trace a series of officially approved actions, Portuguese leadership, beginning with the Treaty of Madrid, and then from the fall of Ensenada to the suppression itself. The Treaty of Madrid is kind of like a reconfirmation of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Again, for people who don't know, in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world between Spanish and Portuguese influence as these places were being discovered for the first time. The Portuguese got the east, and they also got part of Brazil, and the Spanish got the rest of the New World. But the actual borders between the two empires was beginning, you can say, to favor the Portuguese. The Treaty of Madrid was a further affirmation, essentially, of what was the evolving situation on the ground, which was the expansion of Brazil further into the Amazonian rainforest. But there's also the aspect that the Treaty of Madrid had some influence of the British, and that in the sense that they were also carving out and defining borders between the empire, there was an impetus behind solidifying and centralizing state control back in Madrid and back in Lisbon. And that, of course, would necessarily come at the expense of organizations like the Jesuit reductions that you see littered throughout all of these regions on the borders. The crucial role played by Spanish diplomatic agents as compared to those of the Bourbonic crowns, the active Anglophilia of certain figures, such as the Duke of Alba, but even someone could document the existence of a secret and formidable conspiracy capable of manipulating all the Catholic courts in Europe, that would not explain the complexity of this phenomenon. In other words, neither a fortuitous chain of unconnected circumstances nor a perverse, extremely well-planned plot are satisfactory explanations for the suppression. The fact is that in the mid-18th century, the social and cultural climate was already highly favorable for an institution such as the Society of Jesus, whose reason to be and organic structure made it internationalist, leading towards the defense of the church and its interests in relation with the different crowns, and above all, unable to limit itself to a single field of knowledge and thus eliminate the possibility of definitive transcendence, incapable of accepting the notion of a king or a nation, a scientific or social utopia as absolute. Again, another run-on sentence. But even internationalist, the word there, which perhaps he's using intentionally, or perhaps again it's an issue of translation, but internationalism is a very modern concept. It's completely at odds with the notion of what the Jesuits are trying to espouse, which is Christendom. You can't have internationalism in Christendom because it would imply sovereign demarcations between it, and that is not what Christendom is supposed to be. Christendom is supposed to be a whole, not simply a collection of nations. The ironic thing, again, is that when you have organizations like the League of Nations and the United Nations, it seems to be, again, trying to recreate Christendom under a secular impetus in trying to take reality of internationalism that really, you can say, began in the 16th and 17th century, but became a firmly established political fact in the 18th century, and trying to undo it. Instead of concepts like the balance of power, again, we have deference to international law and international organizations. But the emphasis again on the point that the Jesuits ultimately seem incompatible to this notion of the ascendant nation state, and indeed to a dialectic which places science and religion as not just opposites, but enemies. Independently from the diversity of intellectual and even political positions held by Jesuits, there was an insurmountable division between the aspirations of the new governing elites and an organization which, since its foundation, had placed itself in the direct service of an institution whose sphere of activity went beyond the frontiers of culture, state, and dynasty. Despite the devotion to and veneration of science and knowledge they commonly professed as members of a family that had made a dutiful regard for intellect, one of its identifying marks, the Jesuits could not forget that reason was a contingent reality. So again, you sort of look at all of this and say that it constantly comes back to the fact that the Jesuits, in an ideal world, it would seem, would actually be causes to try and mediate these disputes between the quote-unquote Enlightenment and Catholic reaction. And yet the Jesuits, again, you can say almost inevitably, as these two facts, as you can say the humanism, which is born out of the Renaissance, which if you look at its origins, and someone like Dante is trying to remain stringently Catholic, or at least remain so within a Catholic framework. The humanism, which has, you can say, been detached from Catholicism, thanks to the Reformation, and with the crisis, the failures of the various wars of religion in order to recapture the unity of Christendom, now you have the idea of the state transcending religious divides. The state effectively has been elevated. The nation has taken the place of religious unity. And therefore, humanism, which was once attached to the church, has now essentially bypassed the church. And if the Jesuits are trying to hold on to this, again, early humanistic, almost medieval synergy between the two, they cannot own the position of the humanists in this scenario. They will inevitably have the humanists who advocate for a far more radical iteration of we're not just talking about the return of bashing established religion, but we're talking about a whole revolt against civilization which had been created in the aftermath of the Roman Empire, the return to a neoclassical age which basically spurned all of Christian history. That is the radicalism which I'm really referring to. At that time, the questioning of the legitimacy of power and of institutions' spheres of influence occurred again against a backdrop of definition and of the place of the sacred within public space, the division of power and control and resources deriving from it. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the conflicts between the empire and the church, between the monarchs and their courts, their diets or parliaments, spoke of a situation where the effective existence of certain spheres of legitimacy external to the crown was recognized. Indeed, that is the whole premise of the Middle Ages, is the fact that we don't have these tightly sort of knit notions of sovereignty. We have, if we're again going to use modern language, international, supranational organizations which are spread throughout all of Europe and indeed owe their loyalty not necessarily to the particular resident sovereign, albeit again saying they're entirely independent is inaccurate. If you're going back even to the situation with the Knights Templar, all of these religious international organizations, of which of course the Templar is certainly an exemplar of that, were beholden to individual stipulations and relationships, in many cases vertical relationships, with whatever power essentially hosted them. It's not simply a case of saying that these are powers who are completely independent, but nevertheless that was the perception. The perception is such that Henry VIII, basically, you can say there was a political impetus far more than the religious impetus to dissolve the monasteries, because otherwise what would the monasteries have potentially been? The monasteries would have potentially been a source of Catholic and later Spanish power, and so they needed to be broken. Royal power was delimited both by the Church, which aspired to incarnate sacredness and to represent the universal community of believers, and by the subjects, organized into agencies of variable and heterogeneous power, city councils, corporations, courts. Really, if you're looking at the Holy Roman Empire, I mean, the existence of free and imperial cities, of independent duchies, little domains held by imperial knights, the situation goes on, but there's no greater exhibition of this heterogeneous power distribution in all of history than the Holy Roman Empire, especially once it loses its religious unity. From the coronation of Charlemagne to the friction generated around the royal patronage by the way of the sack of Rome, this would have been, I think he's referring to Charles V in 1528, 1527. The emblematic signs of that difference in spheres were the consecration of the French kings and rems and the monarch's appearance before the different collegial bodies. Again, consecration implies that he is receiving his authority, again, potentially from that of the archbishop, or again, directly by God, depending on your interpretation of divine right. And of course, collegial bodies, referring to various organizations which don't owe explicit and sole loyalty to the king. It's the whole theory of the two masters, and this was one of the arguments that Queen Elizabeth made for pushing through the Act of Uniformity, that simply one could not be loyal to two masters, the nation and the church, and so in that case, the nation would always supersede religion. On the contrary, the world begotten by the Enlightenment, followed by the French Revolution, erected altars to reason and sought to legitimize a self-coronation, that of Napoleon, by which an imprisoned pope was reduced to a mere onlooker. And again, that is not true. The pope, who was Pius VII, the first pope, it should be mentioned, who was responsible for restoring the Jesuits in 1814, would indeed become a prisoner of the Pope, but he was not a prisoner of the Pope when he blessed the reign of Napoleon I in Notre Dame de Paris in 1804. Rather, he saw it as a necessary evil in order to allow for the Catholic Church to recover a part of the position it had lost during the French Revolution, a process that had begun years before when Napoleon agreed to Concordat. So, like I said, there is a definite apologetic agenda in this article. This revenge against Canossa was the wish of ministers who embodied the enlightened regimes in Catholic countries, a situation where there would be no God or absolute entity other than the interests of their own estate, which had brought them to power. The glory of the king would be merely a symbolic expression of the new division of power. Despite their confrontations over the dynastic and geopolitical interests of their respective states, the ministers who governed Catholic Europe shared an ambition for unrestricted authority, manifested in a single ideology that went by many names, Royalism. They were united by their determination to deepen as much as possible the religious sphere's subordination to state authority. They desire to make the fragmentations of Christianity a visible reality in national spaces that was self-sufficient in symbolic terms and which bowed to no external or superior authority than was anything other than the nominal in nature. So even situating the term ideology, as far as Alfaro is concerned, is a displacement for theology. And so Royalism would almost be a corruption of theology. I would never go that far. I would say that the conflict between Royalism and, you can say, Guelphism, monism, or whatever, deference to the Pope in his secular authority, is an ongoing feud throughout the entirety of really the last 1,500 years. Just sort of see my To Kill a Catacon, if you want to really understand what I mean by that. But if you're going to try and understand Royalism as a state ideology, you have to look at it as post-Hobbesian. Hobbes's Leviathan is very much, you can say, a weaker iteration of what we see from figures like Baudin and Montaigne, the French writers that were coming out in the 50 years that preceded it. Sorry if I sound rather dismissive to Hobbes here. It's just I believe that the French sort of were really the first to grapple with this topic because they dealt with the French wars of religion. And it was during the French wars of religion that the monarchy, especially under Henry IV, arose to establish basically a direct religious peace between the Catholics and what would then basically refer to as the Huguenots. The point is that if you're going to look at royalism as a post-Christian, a post-medieval ideology, then you can say that Henry IV, who has already been referenced, who should be mentioned, is probably one of these first examples of that, the politic faction. But if you go a bit further in your French history and you look at Louis XIV, his royalism actually seems to be going back to something significantly older, which is Ghibellinism, the idea of the great Catholic monarch, the emperor of Europe, and that sort of thing, and trying to place the Gallican Church, his sort of control over bishops, is far more complicated in saying that royalism is simply a corruption of theology, which is very much the indication here. Clearly, it isn't that any of these ministers wanted to eradicate the church or faith itself. Many of them were devout Catholics, but their recently acquired position of power spurned them to try to consolidate the status of their social groups at the cost of all others. It was simply the confident ingenuousness and their arrogant authoritarianism added to the lack of effective anti-establishment movements, something that would damage the reputation of the skilled politicians in the ranks of the Jesuits, that prompted them to look beyond their own self-interest. The ideological decoy that had guided them had thrown a wrench in their plans, leading them to apply a strategy that would eventually work against them. By attempting to avoid the possibility of an operative realm of the sacred that would not be subordinate to them, the state and the nation generated a series of new situations that they could themselves become the ultimate center of sacredness. If you're going to look at the idea of throne and altar at its most degenerated state, then that is it, the reduction of the sacred space simply to a facet propping up established power. You can basically say, again, that's the origin of the word legitimacy, in a sense, because legitimacy implies something which is far more secular, far more broader in its application, something which is true of any political system at any time. And what better, again, to confirm a state of legitimacy than applying it as sacred quality? But all the better, if it really is to prop up any authority, it has to be subordinated. Another possibility would be to make it burst into a number of isolated and voluble atoms that would spread to the most unexpected part of society in its most extreme forms and varied nuances. The first of these two options later gave rise to nationalisms, totalitarian utopias, and ideologies of racial superiority. The more moderate versions of the second option generated political liberalism and laicism. I definitely wouldn't refer to laicism as politically moderate. While it's more, and just for reference, laicism is what the French Republican administration did in 1905, in terms of basically not just creating the separation of church and state, but it's more fair to say that it was the imposed secular authority upon the church. It wasn't simply a separation of church and state, because the state basically nationalized the church in France with the whole process of laïcité. Is far more radical than that. While its more radical versions branched into the cultures of relativism and various postmodernisms. In the societies of Northern Europe, whose backbone was formed by the business classes, and what he's basically doing that is explicitly referring to theorists rather, like Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. You could almost say that that's rather rote. Yes, thank you, Ian Briggs, for bringing this up in the chat. I do try to, first of all, read, analyze, and look at your chats at the same time. And Exile, the Knight of Malta now, you have been distracting me now for an hour. So I'd very much appreciate it that you try and at least keep your comments on topic. That would be a nice courtesy for me. Thank you very much. The religious sphere, which had broken off from Rome in the 16th century, gradually fragmented into a diffuse deism, an ethic based on the needs of the family and the business, and a patriotism which the clerical sector was charged with stimulating. For their part, the Catholic kingdoms attempted to capture and undivided the symbolic space controlled by the Church and get a stronghold on the entire domain of sacredness, again, throne and altar. Thus, the enlightened regimes of Protestant Europe, moved by entrepreneurial interests, England and Holland in particular, would be very different from those governed by politicians and civil servants in the Catholic countries. The different royalisms of the Catholic states envied the Protestant and Orthodox societies where the states exercised open tutelage over significant aspects of the sacred space and where religious institutions were clearly subordinate to it. What I really mean envied, I think you could almost say that they're catching up in many ways, because so much in terms of the nationalization, the secularization of church property, etc., it begins with Luther and the Reformation. The creation of, first of all, you can say autonomous states, then sovereign states, then nation states as a consequence of that. So yes, the Protestant sort of emergence of a state sort of falls apart as a result of the fragmentation of the Catholic unity in Europe. And just looking, say, for example, at what the Protestants have been able to achieve in terms of their political and commercial success is very tempting, because the 18th century in many ways is a great disaster for so many of the Christian Catholic realms. So Spain and Portugal have long been losing a entrepreneurial commercial battle to the Netherlands and England. The 18th century is also the century in which England definitively replaces France as the country who will basically become the cultural and political hegemon. And indeed, as a language group, the reason why English is the most, you can say, evident international language, even though more people speak Spanish, is because of the events of the 18th century. So just sort of expanding on this notion, yes, you can say there's a bit of envy, but there's also a bit of catching up. And it is essentially a consequence of the Protestant revolutions within these respective realms that causes the impetus for this entire scenario to exist in the first place. The ideal formula for the new Catholic ministers who have come up through the lower and more studious ranks of the bourgeoisie would have been a national religion, like the Anglican Church, where the head of government was also the head of the church, and spiritual affairs were resolved in Parliament. They would even have considered it acceptable to have a situation such as that of Russia, where the Tsarist crown wielded an ironclad fist over orthodoxy. In both cases, religion was simply an instrument of government and a vehicle for creating social space. Again, to qualify that, because again, that's quite a big accusation. What he means by that is that Peter the Great abolished the patriarchate, which would have been the main religious power to oppose him. He also created the position of procurator of the Holy Synod, and the whole notion of the Holy Synod is to create lay figures who will supervise the control over the church. The whole image of the Holy Synod was the eye. It was about inspecting and observing the entire religious practice of the realm, and thereby establishing more centralized control in religious matters for the Tsar. But orthodoxy in its relationship, again, with authority, many people like to use the Francis Fukuyama term of Caesaro-Papist, but it's far more complicated, you can say, than the situation we have with Protestant religions, where, like we see in Prussia or with the Lutheran states such as Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, absolutism and control over religion seems to be far more conducive, I would say, to a far greater extent than we see with orthodoxy. For that same reason, a schismatic empress, Catherine of Russia, what is referred to is, when it comes to the idea of schismatic, is that from the Catholic point of view, schismatic, the Great Schism of 1054, so this is a very old argument. And a heretic king, Frederick of Prussia, being that the Lutherans, again, are a denomination that's split from Rome. They are also schismatic, but they are also heterogeneous, were able to protect the Jesuits when they were Catholic monarchs intent on annihilating their institution. These already held control of the symbolic space of their own society. The institutional body of the Society of Jesus could not call into question their already realized absolutist aspirations and could serve to keep the peace among the different Catholic populations. Moreover, it represented an excellent investment in science and technology. What he's referring to is what I'll get back to at the end. The horrific irony is that the Jesuits will only be spared and will only have a role which is basically protected by power in the areas where there aren't Catholic absolute monarchies, like in Russia, where there were, again, many Catholic populations which have been included in Russia as a result of the partitions of Poland. And with Frederick of Prussia, who of course had annexed large Catholic populations in former Austrian Silesia. So the Jesuits were performing a role that was in the service of an autocratic established sort of central power. I sort of actually row back on this idea of autocratic, but the words they both use is enlightened despotism. Funnily enough, enlightened despotism, when it comes to non-Catholic royalty, works in favor of the Jesuits, because part of that enlightened mentality is appealing to a sense of toleration and a desire to work with the Catholic organizations involving the Jesuits. So if there is, again, an afterlife for the Jesuits, which results ultimately in their restoration in 1814, it is partly thanks to Protestant enlightened despotism and Orthodox enlightened despotism over the Catholics, where the suppression was far more all-encompassing. So this is where I want to come to and really sort of refer to the Jesuits' conciliarism, monism, and coming back to Episcopalianism, the relationship between the Jesuits and this conflict, you can say, between the national churches, the church hierarchy, and the Jesuits as a particular organization. And this is still continuing with Alfaro. A theological dimension which generally underlay royalist positions was the tendency to diminish the achievements of the papal primate in order to emphasize the importance of an episcopal ministry, i.e., the desire to focus. The perfect example of this is the Declaration of the Rights of the Clergy of France in 1681. It's an example. 1682 is an example that I often come back to, because supporting the bishops of the Church of France is far more conducive to the aims of this, what is basically referring to as a corruption of the sacred space to throne and altar, than having the papal affiliated Jesuits in your country. Groups of autonomous bishops who were linked to Rome by a vague sense of fraternity, but were effectively subordinate to their sovereigns. That was the model desired by ministers of absolute monarchies. Again, this isn't a modern idea. This is something you can say actually inspired the whole reforming papacy to begin with, which was all the way back in the 9th century with the Etonians. The Etonians wanted a universal empire with the church as being a subordinate institution. In this case, with the example of the Templars and Philip IV in the 14th century, is the exact same scenario. So it's not just a novel element that's recurring out of all of these elements which seem conducive to the dissolution of the Jesuits, but there had been precedents for it, long precedents in terms of Catholic history, and hence why you can actually understand the climate in which the suppression of the Jesuits is possible. It was an ancient impulse that recalls the theories of conciliarism and the debates of the Council of Constance. And again, the Council of Constance, the idea that the bishops have supremacy over the Pope, something that the popes spent the next 100 years, this was 1415, 1417, distancing themselves from. And with the Council of Trent, not only did they basically seriously refute an attempt to, again, form an alliance with Protestantism. That would have been impossible anyway, given the Protestant stand on the papacy. But it was a reaffirmment of the papacy and its primary role in terms of the whole Counter-Reformation is, again, a bit of an anachronism. The Tridentine reform, the Pope will be leading the efforts of reform, and the Pope will be leading the cause of Catholicism throughout the entire world. This is what was essentially refuting the legacy of the Council of Constance. During the same years as the eradication of the Society of Jesus, there was a concerted effort to promote the cause of the beatification of one Juan de Palafox, Bishop of Puebla. That would be in Mexico now, but would have been then the Viceroyalty of New Spain, brought by the same individuals who advocated the suppression of the Jesuits, beginning with Charles III and Clement XIV, that being the King of Spain and the Pope. The exaltation of this devout shepherd, known for facing up to the mendicant orders, and then to the Society of Jesus, in a series of conflicts during the 17th century, which focused on the defense of the episcopal prerogatives over the Jesuits, who aggressively defended their universalistic privileges of territorial exemption. Again, he's referring back to this argument, which again I sympathize and agree with, because it's an argument that I've made many times myself. The argument of the national churches versus the universal church. How deferential are the bishops to be to their king or to be to their pope? It's never a clear-cut situation in the entire history of Catholic Europe as to what the ideal solution, the ideal formula for that is. It is a situation that's never resolved, and it's something that hasn't been resolved today with the radical redefinition of the church's relationship to the world since Vatican II. But I want to push back against this in sort of the assumption here made in parts that the Jesuits were sort of uniquely opposed to all of this, because that certainly isn't the opinion of other historians, in particular Dale Van Kley, when it comes to understanding the Jesuits and their relationship with the monarchy in France. So returning to his book, The Religious Origins of the French Revolution, how then did the French Jesuits square their oath of obedience with, say, their acquiescence to the Bourbon dynasty's pursuit of a reason of state? The reason of state, you can say Cardinal Richelieu is the perfect example of this, who is a prince of the church who is waging war on the other great Catholic kingdoms in order to pursue the interests of France and the French monarchy over and above that of some sort of, again, notion of uniting against the Protestant interventions in the 30 Years' War. There is no sort of greater example of the reason of state than that. But this has been going on with aspects of Gallicanism in France since the reign of Francis I and Henry II, who also intervened to prop up the Protestants at the expense of the Habsburgs. So the reason of state is not just the consolidation of a national Catholic monarchy in France. It is also the pursuit of, you can say, from the point of view of the Catholics, a disastrous and self-defeating foreign policy, one that was only, you can say, in parts, ironically, remedied just before the French Revolution and around the time that the Jesuits were being suppressed. How, in other words, did they reconcile much maligned ultramontanism, i.e. deference to the Pope, not just in terms of infallibility, but also in terms of his secular role and prerogatives, with the French monarchy's vision of Gallicanism, i.e. there is a national church in France, and it is the king, first and foremost, who has influence over the appointment of bishops, hence why the Episcopalianism becomes such an important facet of this, the role of the bishop in the hierarchy. The answer seems to be that they effected some sort of compromise between the ecclesiastical and temporal aspects of ultramontanism and Gallicanism, and that while eschewing canonical and conciliar Gallicanism, they gradually accepted the newer political Gallicanism, namely the principle of royal accountability to God alone. In other words, they accommodated themselves to a form of divine right monarchy. As early as 1610, so this was the assassination of Henry IV, Pierre Coton went on record in thinking that the kings were the children and sucklings of God, or rather his living image, and in 1626 he disavowed Santarelli's statement of indirect power, declaring himself ready to shed blood in defense of the truth, that their majesties answer independently to God. In other words, completely upturning all the medieval notions of papal supremacy, of hierarchy, where all monarchs are simply invested in their positions by the Pope, and the Pope is liberally in the possession of the right to depose them, even emperors. This argument essentially has been disavowed, disfavored, for the sake of accommodating to the notion that the king doesn't have a authority under the Pope, but you can say a role which is horizontal to the Pope. Coton's Gallican proclivities gained converts among his colleagues with Richelieu's encouragement, given the fact, again, Richelieu was the one advocating for this reason of state, no wonder, only to become even more pronounced under Louis XIV. In the Regale controversy, or Regale controversy with the papacy, Louis XIV's Jesuit confessor, Francois de Leschaise, quite openly sided with his king and frankly declared to the superior general in Rome that in all but dogmatic matters he would sooner obey the king than the Pope. Again, you can say that this is a contradiction in terms of their roles. It's very easy to say the Jesuits are just papal, I'm going to be really derisive and say that they have been accused of being a papal Einsatzgruppen, which is, thoroughly fanatical and implacable in this instance. But the Jesuits also prove themselves to be great confessors to monarchs and rulers throughout the world. And this is, again, part of the reason it's their personal sort of role in basically attending to the spiritual welfare of particular notables and rulers that, again, causes them to have this stain of association, which led to those sexual accusations, which I alluded to earlier. But how can you basically square off the position where you're responsible for the king's well-being, yet also being this advocate for the authority of another power, in this case, the Pope? The lines and the obediences were essentially broken down, and these relationships between being personal confessor and political advocate were again seemingly greatly at odds. By the 18th century, according to Pierre Blette, a good many, if not all, French Jesuits had accepted the conclusion that, as one put it, the first part of the Declaration of 1682, the one I've been referencing regarding the rights of the clergy in France, presents no problem for anyone not blinded by ultra-monetist opinions. And again, for a Jesuit to say that on a position which was later refuted by the Pope, and even Louis XIV would back down on this position, is quite radical. Papal infallibilists, the French Jesuits may have always been at heart. They remained an enthusiastic conciliarists they never became. In other words, they adopted this position as part of what I was saying right at the beginning, in many ways just to assume this position of, realpolitik. There's very little we can do. We have a lot invested in the French state. And this is, again, why them not being Templars is significant in many ways. They don't have any sort of great military orders where they can potentially, again, affect political revolutions, as in some cases the Templars, especially in Cyprus, they're accused essentially of performing. So it leads them into a situation of accommodation and, again, talk about Jesuitical thinking, ideological flexibility. By 1695, Louis XIV himself, as we have seen, was willing enough to abandon this conciliar aspect of the Gallican legacy. But it was otherwise with the principle of the entire temporal independence of the French crown, and on the article, French Jesuits quite simply sacrificed papal indirect power on the altar of divine right power. In other words, the new sort of Catholic sacred monarchy in France is completely abandoning the old medieval arguments positioned by the Pope, by Popes Innocent III and Boniface VIII. And I come back to this idea of a horizontal relationship in the power structure in the church. And if you look at it as horizontal, then inevitably you can say that within their own realms, especially, the kings will no longer seek a horizontal relationship. In many ways, they will seek to create a vertical relationship with the king on top and the church and even the Pope below. So now we've come finally to the impetus behind the actual suppressions, which, funnily enough, begin in Portugal, which, given Portugal's relative power just for reference, the most powerful kingdom, Catholic kingdom in Europe at this time was France, followed closely by Austria. Poland is collapsing, so it's not really fair to comment on the situation in Poland. After Austria, it would be the Spanish crown, and then perhaps Portugal, if you don't seriously include the other sort of Catholic monarchies in Italy, which perhaps had a more profound influence in terms of geopolitics at that time than Portugal did, being on basically the periphery of European affairs as it was. So if Portugal again occupies such a, you can say, ephemeral position in European politics, why did the impetus for such a dramatic act occur from Portugal? In the case of the Templars, you can at least say that it came from the most powerful Christian monarch at that time, that being King Philip IV of France. This is going back to Alfaro. The policies of the Marquis de Pombal were invariably driven by the notion that Portugal and its colonial territories must not lag behind the standards for progress set by the supposedly more advanced and cultural European countries. The debate about Europe, about the idea of a Europe cloaked in the Enlightenment myth of progress, was based on the idea of criticizing the so-called obscurantist system of teaching, in short, the Jesuit system, and the defense of a promotion of a new utopian model that typified the rationalism of the Enlightenment. Regarding obscurantism, which is essentially the belief that information should be, there've been many sort of, the problem with dealing with the definition of obscurantism is often made by people who are opposing it. I would say obscurantism is basically a form of educational elitism. Other people will basically say that it's, as the term suggests, the term is directly pejorative, obscurantism, obscuring the truth. In other words, if the church is supposed to be the ray of light, obscurantism would not just be a system which is anti-enlightenment in the rationalistic sense, as it quite literally is, but it would also in many ways be anti-Christian. Hence why, if you actually think about the etymology and concepts of these words, obscurantism becomes such a, not just again an anti-intellectual concept, but a fundamentally immoral concept. But nevertheless, obscurantism is one of the accusations leveled at so-called Jesuitical thinking, the fact that they're, again, prepared to hide behind nominally sophist arguments and hide their true intentions. But as I've also been at pains to express, the Enlightenment is in many ways the inheritor of a system of education from which the Jesuits essentially helped to typify. The political mentality, which saw the powers of the state as equal to other centers of power, a situation that Pombalism espoused to its fullest, came at the end of a long path that began at the dawn of modernity. The path led to sanctioning of royal power, and consequently the power of the state that represented and embodied it, and thus granting it increasing legitimacy. So again, Arafo is associating the idea of legitimism, royalism, with a post-Christian, a post-theological framework. And with the idea of the dawn of modernity, even among historians, it's basically commonly assumed that modernity begins at the end of the early modern period, at least, begins as a result of various milestones, but it's typically around the 15th and the 16th century, depending on your particular interest. As for the beginning of modernism, it actually tends to be associated with a period slightly later than this, which is the French Revolution. You could also associate it with the Industrial Revolution, depending on whether your interest is more theoretical and conceptual, political, or economic. There are many ways, essentially, of interpreting that concept. If you want my thoughts on modernity sort of more broadly, I think they are best expressed when I talked about Zeitbewusstsein in A Brief History of Time, which is an episode of The Intrusible Chamber. Royalism was a political doctrine that advocated the supremacy of political over ecclesiastical power. And again, royalism in its 18th century manifestation, because again, he's writing from the point of view of Mexican history and thereby extension, the history of the Spanish Empire. So royalism in England has a very specific connotation, which is royalism to King Charles I in the Civil War, the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. And in that situation, there is an Anglican link to it, and there is a very sort of nuanced argument to be made regarding the whole religious nature of the Civil War, which is a fundamental part of it. So royalism, being that of the political supremacy over the ecclesiastical power, is almost incidental when it comes to Charles I, because the Henricean Revolution had already occurred, the English Reformation had already occurred long before that point. So it's kind of a moot point. In France, again, royalism is bound up in a different word, which is politique, which is the emphasis on the interests, the reason of state, as we looked into with Richelieu, over the interests of religion. Because in France at that time, religious power was seemingly connected to Spain. And so to be Catholic first and French second was basically, in many ways, an indication that you might side with Philip II over King Henry III. And in many cases, especially after the murder of the Duke of Guise, Catholics did exactly that. So royalism is an evolving concept and it has specific associations depending on which country you're in. But especially when you come to ultra-royalism in the 19th century, to be ultra-royalist is to be more royalist than the king and to be more Catholic than the Pope, in the sense of being ultra-monarchists. I won't subscribe to an all-encompassing theory of royalism. I simply won't. The temporal power of kings had to be fully confirmed through a process of elimination and conquest, weakening of the centers of power and of the influence of the church. Of particular concern was the church's international aspect. Again, the modernity sort of creeping in with international, with its focus on the Roman Curia. The power was later granted the famous adjective ultramonotone. So again, when Van Kley and other historians are using the sort of terms ultramonotone, ultramonotone is actually German and French in terms of its connotations, because for the French, it means over the Alps, and for the Germans, it means over the Alps, just from a different direction. In other words, that the power of the church is situated in the papacy, which of course is in Italy. And of course, that also has a pejorative indication because it assumes it's foreign as well, which fits into this whole narrative being weaved, essentially, that the issue with the Jesuits, the perception of the Jesuits especially, even though, as we saw with the French example, the reality isn't so clear-cut, is that they are in the service of a foreign power. It's the same argument that was used by the Protestants during the Reformation in Germany, which is the church is a Roman church, it is not a German church. The Pombaline period of Portuguese political history witnessed an excess of royalist-inspired ideology and can be analysed as the culmination of a long struggle between secular power against the supremacy of spiritual power. Commonly known as Enlightened Despotism or Enlightened Absolutism, this was a period when royal power scored significant victories in the traditional struggle against the Roman Curia. Again, he seems to be conflating the term royalist with enlightened absolutist. All sort of enlightened absolutists are royalists, but not all royalists are enlightened absolutists. That would be my my qualifier when it comes to that. I mean, Frederick II had one of the best descriptions of enlightened absolutism: everything for the people, nothing by the people. Competition between priesthood and empire dated back to the Middle Ages. Pombalism was a variation on European royalism, but with certain unique traits. At its basic level, it shared an ideology that shaped other royalist doctrines endorsed by other European monarchies. Models of this that inspired the Portuguese version existed with Gallicanism in France, Febronianism in Germany, and even Erastianism in England. But I will argue that this sort of goes sort of much further than that. But anyway, and he even refers to Leopoldianism in Tuscany, which is the whole notion that later Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II was very much a religious, he inculcated aspects of Febronianism and religious skepticism in Tuscany, which of course was a major problem for the papacy because it was just on its border. But later he would radically sort of redefine his position and become a stalwart opponent to the French Revolution. He also includes, interestingly enough, when it comes to Arafo, Josephism in Austria. And again, this is where, like his imprisonment with the Pope analogy, he seems to be sort of flitting around when it comes to his chronologies, because Josephism is a phenomenon that really only takes control of Austria after the suppression of the Jesuits. So, I mean, Joseph becomes Holy Roman Emperor in 1765, but he doesn't really assert real political authority until the 1770s, and finally when his mother dies in 1780. So to say that Pombolism is an iteration of Josephism is simply untrue. The main political practice in Pombolism was Royalism, which gave way to efforts at creating theoretical foundations and legitimization. Even so, the political doctrine that drove the examination of governmental measures appeared to be drawn from a legislative formula. I've gone over the association with Royalism and legitimacy a lot, so I'm not going to repeat it. Aside from the doctrines of various European theorists that formed the basis of Enlightened absolutism, Pombal had various theologians, ideologists at his disposal, entrusting them with the theoretical implementation of his legislative measures to redefine the church-state relationship. Again, interesting, he's making an equivalency between them as if to indicate that if you back Royalism, you don't exhibit the spirit of being a theologian so much as you are now an ideologist. The renowned theologian and canonist Antonio Pereira de Figueiredo, an Oratorian priest, established the theoretical basis for a Pombaline Royalism, which sought to combat the Tridentine Counter-Reformation's tendency to bolster the Catholic pontiff's power. In other words, this is the very spirit which creates the Society of Jesus in 1540. Figueiredo established principles of divine right of kings, the sacredness of their power, which gods conferred directly on their secular sovereigns, hence the horizontal relationship. In analysis, he specified to what end that power should be exerted, concluding that it should be directed at the well-being and improvement of human society and the happiness of all vassals. Again, Frederick II, everything for the people, nothing by the people, to ensure the effectiveness of political action and guarantee the harmony of the community of subjects. It will be absolutely essential for the Church to yield to the laws of the temporal monarchs who would serve as the supreme authority in all secular matters, and indeed, by implication, also to some extent, religious matters. So it sort of comes here and we go to the actual sort of the logistics. So that, as far as Arafo is concerned, is the premise of enlightened despotism in Portugal. But the actual narrative and the whole sort of circumstances for the suppression, as Jonathon Wright here explains in his book on the Jesuits, are far less grandiose in terms of this all-encompassing European scope about Royalism as an ideology. In some cases, it would be funny if it wasn't tragic. Long energized by bizarre, groundless rumors of hidden Jesuit wealth and a Jesuit effort to establish a state within a state, this would be the fixation particularly with the Jesuit reductions. Enemies of the order were outraged when some Jesuits in Lisbon seemed to preach to the Indians' defense, claiming that asking them to leave behind their homes and possessions was despicably cruel. And again, this is a classic thing regarding the Jesuits, is that something I wish I could do, but again, like many things, I don't feel qualified to do so, is to do a Jesuit history of the New World, which it should be mentioned, has basically evolved into a series about the Jesuits, which I didn't intend, one on Japan, one on China. So logically, the next one would be the Jesuits in the Indies. And the Jesuits were behind the momentum of the arguments using Aristotelianism in particular to justify the relationship between the natives and the colonial Spanish. So this is not a tired trope that's being used. This actually has a great deal of veracity behind it. But it's, I think, the combination of a willingness to defend as we saw with the optimistic view on humanity and humanism, is the desire to elevate the native populations in the New World, coupled with the fact that the Jesuits are great landowners, especially in Paraguay. if I remember correctly, people can correct my pronunciation, but the largest native population, the Guarani, are still, you can say, of many of the Native American groups that we see in South America are far the most prominent, and hence why Paraguay occupies this unique position in many ways in the makeup of South America. That is the situation in which the Jesuits draw most of their power in the New World. Unfounded rumors circulated that the society was behind the Indian rebellions. Portuguese and Spanish troops succeeded in crushing the Guarani resistance, and the Indians were obliged to choose between submission and resettlement. But the anti-Jesuit bandwagon was only just beginning to gather steam. Notice the fact that the Portuguese and Spanish troops, because this is occurring on the border between the two empires, hence why I go back to the Treaty of Madrid and its significance, is because it's drawing and delimiting the powers and the respective sovereign zones of these two monarchs. And already they are seeing it in their collective interest to establish a sovereign possession over their overseas empires against the Jesuits. Over the next months, the years, Pombal engineered the expulsion of several Jesuit preachers and confessors from court, and an increasingly outlandish anti-Jesuit propaganda campaign was waged in the press. Jesuits were even accused of being behind riots against the governmental wine monopoly in Oporto in 1757, which they had supposedly quipped that the company's wine didn't even taste good enough to be used in the Eucharist. By the middle of 1758, Cardinal Sandana, the papally appointed investigator of Jesuit affairs in Portugal, had concluded that scandalous commercial activity was rife inside the society's Portuguese houses. And then, on the night of September the 3rd, 1758, someone shot the king in the right shoulder. At first, the crime was kept quiet, and reports circulated that the king had simply suffered a fall in his garden. When it finally emerged that his illicit affair with one Teresa de Tavora and the wounded pride of her relations was probably to blame for this full-fledged assassination attempt, the suspected culprits, including the Duke of Aveiro, were arrested. This was a welcome opportunity for Pombal to attack what he perceived as the willful independence of the Portuguese nobility, but he did not forget his other, more prissy enemies, and almost inevitably the Jesuits began attracting suspicion. By one typically outlandish account, the would-be assassin had been encouraged by Jesuits as their local professed house, and told that killing the king would count only as a venial sin. Again, it's interesting looking at the Templars, that history is repeating itself again, because it's the whole narrative of a moral campaign being waged by the state against the religious order, with insinuations that the order is behind an assassination attempt. Both occurred in the case of the Templars and the suppression of the Jesuits in Portugal. By early January, Jesuits were being arrested. One of them, one aged Gabriel Malagrida, endured a particularly vile imprisonment and showed signs of going mad, if holding conversations with God, the Virgin Ignatius, and Charles Borromeo can be so construed, and was finally strangled and his remains buried in 1671, denounced, as one contemporary reported, as puffed up with pride and insolence, which made him, in his own conceit, superior in merit to the rest of mankind. Again, this would sort of go back to the Jesuitical archetype, is that the society is at once advocating all of these elevated humanist themes and wanting to represent themselves as Christian optimists, even alluding to the idea of the perfectibility of man against man's fallen nature. And yet the order themselves and how they conduct themselves appear to be haughty, aloof, and contemptuous of all other aspects of Catholic society. Again, it's sort of a perfect storm in terms of creating the perfect Jesuit stereotype. But in the case of this instance, even Voltaire thought the treatment of this old priest was unnecessarily cruel, and Voltaire has loomed large over this conversation. In February, all of the capital's Jesuits were restricted to 3 of their houses, and the selling off of surplus food and kitchen equipment began. In April, the entire society was formally banished from Portugal, and by September, the first ships leaving Lisbon, heading for the refuge of the Papal States, were the first boatload of priests, men denounced as being in rebellion with the Portuguese crown, would arrive on October the 24th. In all, some 1,100 Jesuits would be banished, and over 250 being consigned to Pombal's prisons. In the ensuing months and years, the shockwave moved around the world, and Jesuit priests were thrown out of Portugal's overseas possessions. Look at this, and the whole sort of Philip the Iron King connection between de Pombal, and look to France. And the situation is almost the complete inverse in many ways. It's very easy, as Arafo has done, in terms of trying to look at enlightened absolutism as a uniform formula throughout Europe, especially in terms of creating some sort of overlap between the Bourbon monarchies. And by that, he refers to the Kingdom of France, Spain, and Naples. It's very easy to imply they all have some sort of set agenda, almost as an emanation of the Pacte de Famille, that they have a dynastic policy. But again, the situation in France is testament to the fact that enlightened absolutism was never achieved. Louis XVI may have attempted to achieve it, but failed astronomically. And if there is an absolutism in France, again, it was achieved under very sort of fraught circumstances, involving a continual struggle against the Parlement. And this is where I want to move away from Wright and come back to Van Kley, who examines the exact and particular situation, which, in contrast to the zeal of this, would-be sort of the great minister of the enlightened despot, who had also again been subject to a fully fledged assassination attempt, again indirectly responsible for the Jesuits, again according to the mythology. We have the example in France. Beginning in the latter 1750s, so this again at the time of the Suppression in Portugal, with obscure trials in the consular courts of Marseille and Paris, an offensive against the Jesuits was continued until 1766, by which time even confessors and preachers had disappeared from the royal court. Again, remember how important the role of the Jesuit confessor had been to high-ranking nobles and royalty, not just in Europe, but the world. Its crucial moment, however, came on the 6th of August, 1761, so 3 years later after the Portuguese suppression, when appealing the Jesuit constitutions and formula of vows, and comme debut, the Parlement of Paris forbade any further recruitment to the society and closed its colleges after a short delay. The 7 Years' War, it is true, came to the aid of the Jansenist party against the Jesuits, even more dramatically than it did in the case of the refusal of the sacraments controversy. And again, this is sort of alluding to a very old struggle between the Jesuits and the Jansenists. The Jansenists were they've been referred to as semi-Pelagian, which interestingly enough is something that was argued of the Jesuits themselves, that the Jesuits had Pelagian tendencies as well. But the Jansenists were a heretical subsect of Catholicism, which tried to take aspects of Augustinianism and in particular sort of aspects of Calvinism. It comes out of Holland, but it becomes very in vogue in the universities in Paris, and then it is suppressed by a papal bull, Unigenitus, and it lingers on kind of like a sort of after effect of the Huguenot suppressions essentially in the establishments and the institutions in France. It almost becomes like a hereditary aristocracy in many ways, the Jansenists occupying positions like the parliaments and the generalities throughout France. And as the Jesuits again were enforcing the papal bull, they became the conflicting party against the Jansenists. It was the Jesuits against the Jansenists throughout most of the 17th and the 18th centuries. And so the situation in France situates it as a conflict between two religious groups who have this centuries-long animosity directed towards one another, in which case basically the king almost plays a bystander. The 7 Years' War, it is true, came to the aid of the Jansenist party against the Jesuits even more dramatically than it did in the case of the refusal of the sacraments controversy, for it was the English Navy's seizure of several vessels bearing merchandise on its way to Marseille from the French Jesuit missionaries on the Caribbean island of Martinique that put the last nail in the declining fortunes of the Père de la Valette, head of that mission, as it was La Valette's financial misfortunes that caused the bankruptcy of its chief creditors in France, the House of Liancey and Joffre, based in Marseille. Having first sued the Jesuits, West Indian missions to no decisive financial effect, Liancey and Joffre and some of their creditors then sued the whole Society of Jesus in France and obtained a favourable verdict from the Consular Court of Paris in 1760. The French Jesuits, their numerous enemies, not only upheld it, but succeeded in widening the case to challenge the Jesuits' very right to exist in France, demanding to see hitherto unexamined and unapproved constitutions. As we see with the situation with the reductions in Paraguay, it is a colonial fiasco, this time in the French Caribbean possessions, that is stoking the flames of this desire to discredit and dismantle the Jesuits. It is also true that these enemies pursued their case against the Jesuits with the help of the benevolent neutrality both of the king's titled mistress, Madame de Pompadour, perhaps resentful of the continued denial of absolution by her court confessors, and the Secretary for War and Foreign Affairs, one Etienne Francois Duc de Choiseul, happy to throw the Jesuits to the parliaments in return for cooperation on the fiscal front. De Choiseul is a fascinating figure in French history, especially when it comes to foreign policy, in which I'm far more familiar with his role. But it seems again that the role of confessor is acting as a major detriment to the Jesuits, in the sense that, of course, Madame de Pompadour is the maîtresse en titre. She is the official mistress of the king, and so she is living in a state of sin, and she will commit many, I would say, gross acts in terms of trying to hold on to her position, involving supporting the king's various lustful proclivities. But notice also that France is in a situation where you have petticoat dominion, petticoatocracy, what Frederick II were basically paraphrasing elements of how Frederick II would look at the situation in France. And you don't have a situation which is basically as conducive to a sacred monarchy appealing to the Pope. At the very least, their neutrality counteracted the efforts of the courtly party devout, led by the Dauphin and the Chancellor, to save the Jesuits by reforming them to the aim of various aborted royal edicts that the Parliament of Paris circumvented with the help of the provincial parliaments in the spring of 1762. In other words, we're seeing a final argument of trying to bring back the sort of universalist Christian arguments of the Jesuits' role, that the monarchy should again have, the French monarchy should resist this reason of state, and it should appeal to Catholic unity above all else. This is simply one party among many factions in France, as the king is basically being led by his mistresses. At most, Choiseul's secret encouragement may have prompted the Parliament's Jansenist party to transform the case against La Valette into the trial of the Jesuits in the first place. In any case, it was surely with his and Pompadour's approval that Louis XV reluctantly put the seal of royal approval on the Parliament's actions against the Jesuits with the Edict of November 1764, which dissolved the Jesuit society while allowing them to live as particulars within the realm. It wasn't nearly as dramatic as we saw with the case of the Templars, but for all intents and purposes, the order had effectively ceased to exist, and as a result of factional strife. So rather than the victory for enlightened absolutism, the Jesuits are simply easy prey. They have already been attacked in various other monarchies in Europe. The Pope, as we'll see with Clement XIV, is not desirous to impose his ultramonarchist or any sort of indication of that sort of belief in papal supremacy over the monarchs in France. The devout party in France is very weak. It's been especially weak since the death of the Duke of Burgundy, the king's father, the King Louis XV's father, in 1712. And so all of these events culminate in what you can say is a great anticlimax, which is the suppression in France. So now we come to the suppression in Spain, which, as I've already sort of alluded to, mimicked the suppression in Portugal. And this is taken from another article by Maurice, Whitehead, and as usual, you can find all the links in the description. In Spain, there were little under 3,000 Jesuits operating in the mid-1760s, with approximately a further 1,500 working across the Spanish Empire, though the influence of the Jesuits was very considerable. After all, they had run the Colegio Imperial and the Seminario de Noblesse. The king, Charles III, had his own ideas about how the Spanish church should be run, that is, with minimum interference from Rome. What they're referring to here is that ever since Charles V, there had been this collegiate system governing many of the colonial possessions and the different crowns of the Spanish monarchy, the Council of the Indies being one of these. These were eventually reformed. And again, I'm not an expert by any means in the Bourbon monarchy in Spain, but I believe the Colegio Imperial, the Imperial College, was some form of successor to the Council of the Indies. The Jesuits have been very influential, as have many other Catholic advocates, including Dominican priests, especially during the time of Philip II. So they're continuing on in that legacy. But of course, Jesuit, their role in the New World, it's just sort of continuing on with the same trend where we saw in Portugal and we see with France. He was also vexed, the king, by the Jesuits' strong opposition to a pet project of his, the securing of the canonization of a Mexican bishop, one Juan Palafox de Mendoza, a strong opponent of the Jesuits. At the court in Madrid, there was growing political opposition to the Jesuits, not least from those who saw them as an obstacle to increasing calls for educational reform. As in Portugal and Spain, all that was lacking was a spark to ignite the tinderbox. That came in the spring of 1766, so just a few years after the French suppression, from a totally unexpected direction, when the highly unpopular Spanish Minister of Finance, the Marquis of Esquilache, had legislation enacted forbidding the wearing of traditional broad-brimmed hats and capes on the pretext that these provided too useful a disguise for criminals. Such an assault on traditional Spanish costume proved too much for an already alienated population, which had suffered a series of bad harvests, high prices, and rising taxes. Serious riots ensued, forcing the king to escape from Madrid. Though law and order was somewhat re-established, the unexpected violence shook the Spanish government and presented a huge blow to Charles III's reformist agenda. The main sort of emphasis on the reformist agenda was centered around the New World, it should be mentioned. The Bourbon reforms indicate that they wanted to turn the empire into something called essentially economic theory mercantilism, which was counteracting the dominance of foreign traders in the Caribbean and much of the Spanish Empire, in particular Dutch and even now English traders in the region of the Caribbean, who had been there really since Cromwell. And mercantilism was about consolidating all of the resources and still the bullion that was still coming in through the Spanish treasure ships into the treasury in Madrid, a reconsolidation of the empire across the world. As blame for the violence needed to be apportioned, attention turned to the Jesuits, and they were accused with little or no evidence of having been the principal agitators of these riots. A savage attack on the society ensued, leading the king to signing an order on the 27th of February, 1767, requiring the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain and its dominions. This was promulgated in Madrid. Jesuit houses were razed and emptied, and having been stripped of most of their possessions, the Jesuits were then expelled and banished to the Papal States, from which the Pope had to turn away to avoid being overwhelmed. The full implementation of the king's order in the various parts of Spanish America and the Philippines was to take another 3 years, involving the expulsion of all Jesuits from these territories. Statistics conceal harsh human realities. Of the 2,600 Jesuits listed by the Spanish colonial authorities responsible for the expulsions, only 2,267 managed to reach their first European destination, the port of de Santa Maria Nicodes. Some 200 died, either making their way through the jungle or crossing rivers to reach their part of embankment. Others perished at sea en route to Spain. Another 100 fell ill and were unable to travel. The rest escaped. While the orders of the Spanish king could not be ignored or countermanded, the application of the decree in Paraguay in 1768, viewed through the long lens of history, was to prove in large measure an act of self-destruction by the Spanish imperial authorities, and ultimately hastened the end of their rule in that region. The 78 Jesuits remained in the reductions of Paraguay, were rounded up and forced to leave their missions. On the 22nd of August 1768, they set sail for Europe in December of that year. Ultimately, the majority of the expelled Jesuits from the colonies were to be sent to various cities within the Papal States. The Jesuit college at Veneza was to be the base of the exiled missionaries from Paraguay. During their sea journey to Europe, how many of them could have realized that they were effectively sailing towards suppression? Now, this is the funny thing, all of this, and we have the suppression by the Pope himself, and this is an account. It's actually quite an old article. It's John MacErlean writing in the 1930s, but nevertheless, following on from that, rather sort of expedient conclusion to the Spanish suppression, it follows the culmination of this tragedy, which is to have like we saw with the Council of Vienne and the Council of Lyon with Clement V and the Templars, the papal validation of what was essentially by then, as we can see, a fait accompli, albeit the papacy had wrangled with the Portuguese. Say, for example, relations between Portugal and the papacy had virtually completely broken down throughout the 1760s. And as we can also see, much of the relationship between Spain and the papacy suffered as a result of this conflict as well. I can't tell if you're joking. After his election, Pope Clement XIV reversed the policy of his predecessor as Pope and tried to conciliate the Bourbon courts in every way possible, that being Naples, France, and Spain, remember. He treated the general superior of the society with discourtesy. Then he appealed to congratulate him on his election and refused to admit him thereafter. He withdrew Clement XIII, his predecessor's brief of excommunication against the Duke of Parma, who was another one of these minor Bourbon princes. He abolished the public reading of the bull in Coena Domini on Holy Thursdays. He created Pombal's brother a cardinal, and there's no greater testament you can say to attacking the Jesuits in terms of symbolic acts than making Pombal's brother a cardinal. But all these concessions could not placate the hostile courts, which insisted imperiously on the abolition of the society. Hence why you can say the divine right has gone from a horizontal position in which, the Pope is definitely not above the rulers, but has a position essentially of, a broad sort of poorly defined relationship between the national churches, but one that ultimately favors the royal courts. And as we're seeing with the Templars, now this is the secular authorities of the Catholic, quote unquote, enlightened despots in Europe imposing what they have done, their actions on the Pope. And to some extent, you can understand his actions, given the situation which he found. It would have taken a very defiant Pope, I believe, in order to resist the inexorable tide at that point. Then began a struggle that lasted 3 years, during which Clement, month after month, attempted to stave off a final decision. He requested proofs of the crimes alleged against the society. One of the acts of the Pope raised a storm. On the 12th of July 1769, the Pope renewed, according to custom, the graces and privileges of the society in a note addressed to his beloved son, Lorenzo Ricci, general of the society. We willingly concede the treasures of those heavenly gifts which the Almighty wishes us to dispense to those who by their charity towards God and their neighbour and their zeal of the Christian religion procure, as we know, with all earnestness the salvation of souls. These words, though merely an official formula, aroused a protest from the Bourbons. The ambitious Zelada was the first to stir up the fire of fury. Ministers returned to the attack. By the 8th of August, His Holiness had already promised 4 times that he would suppress the society. Bernice says, the whole art of the affair must now consist in getting the Pope to take some steps day by day so that he will find himself enmeshed in the net in a way that he will not be able to extricate himself without creating a scene. When Bernice repeated his demands on the 20th of November, 1769, the Pope said that he had not promised to suppress the society immediately, but only when circumstances would permit. 10 days later, however, Bernice had better success. On the 30th of November 1769, he induced the Pope to give a formal promise in writing to the King of Spain that he would suppress the society. Choiseul considered this later to be the most important step forward they had made. Hitherto, Clement had given only verbal and conditional promises, but now that they had obtained a written and unconditional promise, the Pope could not go back. Benny claims that the whole credit of this exploit. The question now is not to know whether the Pope wishes to avoid suppressing the society or not, but whether His Holiness, after the formal promises he has made in writing to the King of Spain, can dispense himself without executing them. This letter, which I made him write to the Catholic King, bides him so firmly, if the court in Spain does not change its sentiments, the Pope is forced, in spite of himself, to finish this work. Nevertheless, the Pope succeeded in postponing his final decision for 2 years, during which he proceeded to carry out the plan of placating the Bourbons by humiliating the society. He tolerated and encouraged the excesses of one Malavezzi at Bologna, and the equally iniquitous proceedings of one Malafocci and his 2 underlings, Macedonio and Alfini, in the visitation of colleges and seminaries in Rome, of which the Jesuits had the administration, among which was the Irish College. But we must not pass over these events in a hurry. On to the 29th of November 1772, when Clement gave a final undertaking to suppress the society. The new Spanish ambassador, Monino, arrived in Rome on the 4th of July 1772, determined to bring matters quickly to a head. He began immediately to terrorize the Pope by holding forth on the dire consequences of a refusal to comply with the wishes of the courts. In an audience on the 23rd of August, the Pope told him of a new plan he had of attaining the desired end. He would let the society die out by forbidding the reception of novices and cripple its power by withdrawing faculties for preaching and hearing confessions. Indeed, as you can remember, that was the French position before a more definite revocation of the rights of the society to continue operating in France a couple of years later. Monino, the Spanish ambassador, rejected this proposal, and a week later produced a plan of his own. The plan was derived from the Pragmatic Sanction of 1767, by which Charles I banished the society from the dominions of Spain, and as we saw, created an exodus and in many ways a refugee crisis for the Jesuits who had all come to the Papal States, or at least most of them. It contained 18 articles, which were but here. It was a question of an answer to an official demand. It had hitherto been possible for the Pope to reply non possumus, not possible, though indeed he had not the strength enough of character to do so. But from this on his hands, on this matter, his hands were tied. Early in that December, Monino's draft had handed to Zelada, who put forward an oath of secrecy and ordered to collaborate with Monino in drawing up the future brief. Zelada finished his revision on the 20th of December, and on the last day of the year 1772, Monino reported, Zelada has examined my draft of the Bill of Suppression and approved it. He praised it beyond any measure and had only 4 insignificant changes to request, which I adopted immediately. This document, says Pastor, agrees substantially with the brief of suppression, Dominus ac redemptor. No changes except of a formal character were subsequently made. The draft was handed to the Pope on the 6th of January and who told Monino on the 17th of January that he only had insignificant changes to make in terms of the wording. Negotiations then to secure the adhesion of other European powers following the Edict of Suppression, such as Austria, caused further delay. Mary Theresa had at first supported the Society of Jesus. But the marriage alliance between her daughter Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, the future King of France, induced her, for political reasons, to proclaim her indifference and readiness to accept whatever the Pope should decide. It's very interesting. Obviously, I have a particular investment in this topic, as you know, I've spoken a lot about Mary Theresa. Mary Theresa is this anomaly among all of the European leaders I've mentioned. Again, the issue with Arafo's account, in terms of it almost being deterministic in a way, which I would disagree, albeit the sort of general thrust of his argument again has, you know, a truth to it, which I've unpacked. Austria, the second greatest, you know, Catholic monarchy in Europe, had, under Mary Theresa, been a great adherent to the Catholic Church and Catholic tradition, whilst the Bourbon reforms, you can say, had the extra incentive of trying to increase royal control over the colonies. The Habsburgs in Austria didn't have that similar consideration because they didn't have any foreign colonies. Any attempt at colonies had been snuffed out by the dissolution of the Ostend Company. But here, the idea of the marriage between Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI being responsible for it is, again, it's almost sadistic in terms of a cruel irony, because, as I was referring to, part of the reason the Jesuits suffered and were the target of accusations for so much of their history was because of France's reason of state, which meant reason to wage war against the Habsburgs. Now the Habsburgs are finally in alliance with the French, you know, sincerely for the first time really in their history. And yet, this is proving an impetus to suppress the Jesuits. It seems, you know, completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? This should be the great moment of triumph for the Jesuits and the devout faction. So I think there's something more to this. Obviously, the French had already suppressed the society, so I'm talking about this in very general terms. And you know, it's an irony, of course, but historically, it's a rather moot point, which is again part of the greater tragedy of the Jesuits. But I think this decision is probably more the result of the influence of Joseph II. I alluded to the fact that Joseph obviously had no influence on de Pombal because he didn't become emperor until 7 years after de Pombal's actions against the Jesuits, and he didn't really assert influence until much later. But it's during this time, so 1773, that Joseph is having a more assertive role, especially when it comes to the matters of the Bavarian succession, as we see later on. By the late 1770s, he's almost in complete control of at least the imperial policy of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. So I think it's this nascent Josephianism, which is very much in the mold of the enlightened despot, the archetype which has been explored, you know, at great length on this stream, that we can perhaps attest a reason as to why Mary Theresa would facilitate on such an important decision when she perhaps again could have spared the order given the power of the Habsburg monarchy. When this declaration reached Rome, it was felt that the opinions of the lesser Catholic princes could be despised. The printing of the brief had now begun. It was done so privately, for the Pope could not entrust his apostolic council, which is very interesting, the idea that they would take the brief and destroy it. This reveals a great weakness of his policy. He had cut himself off from all those to whom the Pope should have looked to for advice and support. He did not consult the College of Cardinals, for he knew they would oppose the suppression. Letters from the bishops of the Catholic world were liable to interference. When the bishops of Germany wrote to the Pope in favor of the society, bear in mind that many of these bishops would have come from areas such as Bavaria and indeed Austria. One Bishop Bottemi interceded the document and delivered it to Monino. In other words, these had been circumvented and handed straight over to the Spanish. Surrounded as he was by a small group of hostile cardinals, self-seeking officials and corrupt favorites, the wonder is that he held out so long. Even as late as the 1st of July, the Spanish ambassador complained, "It is incredible how much it cost me to get the Holy Father to advance as quickly as the business demands." But the constant pressure told in the end. On the 21st of July 1773, the Pope did indeed sign the brief of suppression. Well, indeed, the pastor may say, if any fact can ever be proved from official documents, may pastor say, if any fact can ever be proved from official documents, it is evident that in this affair enormous pressure was brought to bear on the Pope. A congregation appointed to deal with the execution of the brief, selected on the 16th of August as the day of publication. On that day, one Secretary Macedonio, accompanied by soldiers and police, appeared in the evening at the Gesu and denounced the dissolution of the order. The general and his assistants were detained in the English College till the 23rd of September, when they were transferred as close prisoners to the castle Sant'Angelo. Exactly a year later, Clement IV died. During these 12 months, he was a prey to the profound mental depression. According to Pastor, there cannot be the slightest doubt that this recurrent despondency that connected with the suppression of the society. The brief of the 21st of July 1773, says Pastor, again this is a historical account, signified the visible victory of Illuminism and state absolutism over the church at its head, in which case Pastor's account would very much echo Arafa's account. But there is an irony here, which I must point out because no one else is going to make it, is that Bavaria, being one of these German states which would have so been, been the source of so much in the way of Catholic bishops and letters flocking to Rome, interceding on behalf of the Jesuits. Once the brief of suppression came through, the Elector of Bavaria was very happy in following the example of the Spanish because, as with all of these examples, it meant that he could appropriate their property. But it was the same Bavaria that a decade later, having enthusiastically suppressed the Jesuits, went on to completely crush the Illuminati. So if it was a victory for the Illuminati, it only lasted 10 years. This comes to the Jesuits as the great what if of the French Revolution. And I want to come back to Alfaro's, this as a sort of a counterpoint, a way of stimulating conversation in this regard. The suppression of the Society of Jesus led to the disappearance from Catholic societies of the most qualified to kindle dialogue between the traditional order and the anticipated renovation. Extreme positions would only become more radical and, during the 19th century, could give rise to some reactionary monarchic restorations and a tense Catholic culture. On the other hand, the modernizing tendencies of the Enlightenment would find continuity in 19th century liberalism, and as such the rift would become deeper and deeper, setting back generations the necessary reconciliation between certain liberals and conservatives, converted, largely due to the suppression, into Jacobins from the tertiary age and Catholics of Peter the Hermit. I bring this up because I disagree with a lot of it, but it poses some interesting questions, if not disagreeing with all of it. The notion of kindling dialogue between the traditional order and the anticipated renovation. Alfaro, writing again as a man sort of in vogue with the modern Jesuit order, which is a subject which I don't want to tackle here because it's almost completely irrelevant and in a depressing way. If you want to hear my opinions of the Jesuits, I'll simply say this in terms of modern day. If it were the 17th century and I were called to a vocation and I was to pick an order, I would be a Jesuit. If I were called to a vocation today, I would be a Dominican. But notice the point about dialogue. It's this idea that rather than acting as a great bastion for the Pope and facing down the revolutionaries, because a huge impetus of the French Revolution is to continue the national revolution, the revolution of nation states, and that inevitably actually leads to a perverse sense of ideological capture and then the weird consequence, internationalism. of Napoleon, and before him, the attempt to create sister republics throughout the revolution. First, we will make France purely sovereign. Then we will remove all aspects which are supposedly sundering the sovereignty of the popular nation of France, which of course means the king and the church. And then we will impose France on all the countries in the world. So it's not simply a case of all of these nations becoming sort of sovereign entities. No, it is the volition of France to become an imperial power. The notion then of dialogue seems incredibly idealistic, as if the Jesuits, who have basically been consigned to this dialectic, this hostile dialectic of science versus religion by figures such as Voltaire and many figures preceding him, as if they could have triumphed over that. I don't see that as possible. If I'm going to look at the Jesuits, I basically look at them as assuming a position similar to Catherine the Great and similar to Leopold, which is looking on the events of the French Revolution with horror and doing everything in their power basically to check it, even inviting foreign interventions. And as we see, it just leads to the horrific state of the French clergy, which is virtually decimated between 1792 and the Concordat of 1801, which normalizes many aspects of the Catholic Church in France again, but not the Jesuits until 13 years later, of course. Then there is the notion that he talks about the tense Catholic culture. I don't really want to belabor this point so much because it's not so much related to the Jesuits. But having sort of emphasized that the role of the Jesuits was to be a mediator between the old and the new, which I think, like I said, by that time was virtually impossible. You have to look on his sort of perception of liberals and conservatives as Jacobins from the tertiary age and the Catholics of Peter the Hermit. Part of the accusation against the Restoration in France is that it was the Restoration that restored nothing. You have figures like Chateaubriand and de Maistre who'd looked at the legacy of the French Revolution. They tended to account for it, but more or less their revolution would be some victories in the form of Napoleon III, certainly, but by the late 19th century, the cause of Catholic restoration in France occupies a far more niche position within society. By and large, the conservative population in France is Catholic, but politically they're represented on the fringes, like we see with Charles Maurice and Action Française. In the rest of Europe, I think what he's referring to are the Carlsbad decrees of Metternich, and the argument which has been made, the Catholic critique against that, is simply that because the Pope was not part of this new sort of reactionary order, that it simply became a defense of the monarchy of right, i.e., the monarch has the right to dispose of his realm as he so pleases, and it doesn't have this broader theological dimension, which is an argument I actually endorse. I believe that's a fundamental failing of Metternich and his whole order that was constructed. I'm not necessarily sure, though, that Alfaro is advocating for that position, because if he believes that Catholicism of the 19th century and modern conservative Catholicism, by which you can basically say the Society of Pius X, are the Catholics of Peter the Hermit, who by reference was a religious demagogue in the 11th century, who was so passionate and so convincing that he led the peasants, the peasants' crusade before the princes' crusade, which all got massacred, and given also the views of Peter the Hermit when it comes to the Jews. There is nothing of Peter the Hermit and any sort of branch of modern Catholicism as we see. So I find that comment, really rather baffling. But nevertheless, I really wanted to interrogate that notion of the Jesuits occupying this idealistic position as mediators between the old and the new. It's basically the assumption that, as we saw with Dante, the humanist and the Catholic worlds could mutually exist, reinforce, and indeed become, in many ways, actually inseparable. the terrestrial paradise and the celestial paradise, but I don't believe necessarily that Alfaro is thinking that far ahead. But again, it's a question that I've thought about very deeply, or at least the pretense of depth. So this sort of comes to the issue of how were the Jesuits able to survive? And this is an article, the final segment, from Brian O'Leary's article on the period of suppression between 1773 and the mentioned date of 1814, the fall of Napoleon. How did the Jesuits' spirituality come to exist during these years? This can be attributed to a number of factors. The first is the refusal of Frederick of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia to have the bull of suppression promulgated in their territories. So Prussia, for a short period, and white Polish-speaking Russia, that being the partitioned area, for the whole period, became territories where the society was able to maintain an actual physical presence. Particularly in Russia, this presence allowed for a continuity of formation, ministry, and governance. Young men traveled to Russia for many centuries to make their novitiate. Again, it's sort of tragic and ironic that that had to be the case, but it also could explain the attitude of someone like a de Maistre and why he would look at the Jesuits and their disbanding as being a great force in terms of accelerating the course of the French Revolution. Because de Maistre spent his career as a Savoy minister as being a minister to St. Petersburg. And to such an extent, his sort of Catholic fervor was such that Alexander was worried that many of the St. Petersburg court would indeed convert to Catholicism. But that strangely means that having de Maistre and his link with Russia would reinforce the idea of the necessity of the Jesuits during the revolutionary epoch in Europe. The second factor in the survival of Jesuit spirituality was the enduring minister of the former Jesuits throughout the suppression. Many became incardinated in dioceses all over the world and worked as secular priests. In other words, they had to abandon their Jesuit affiliation, of course. A number lived to see the restoration, that being the restoration of the monarchy, and rejoin the society. So also the restoration of the monarchy and the restoration of the order take place in the same year, 1814, and 40 years means that some of the novitiates who would have been inaugurated into the society in their 20s and 30s would now be in their 60s and 70s. So there was still a possibility that the very men who had suffered, again, all of the expulsions that we see, especially from the Spanish and Portuguese empires, would have been able to join the society again before their deaths. They were, of course, old at this point, but played a significant role in guaranteeing a continuity of the spirit and the traditions of the society. So unlike something dramatic like we see with the Templars, the tradition is not simply something that is reimagined. It is a tradition which is carried on through the same people. In that sense, the tradition between the old and the new, really referring to the first few decades of the society's reform in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s, is that of a living tradition, which helps, of course. The third factor in a transmission of Jesuit spirituality took a more indirect form. It came through the establishment of two groups of priests whose way of life was based on the Jesuit model. Between 1792 and 1794, being the height of the French Revolution, two French priests, former seminarians at Saint-Sulpice in Paris, Eleanor de Tournelly and Charles de Brugelet, founded the Society of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Its members lived in anticipation of the restoration of the Society of Jesus and proposed to enter it when circumstances allowed. On de Tournelly's death in 1797, he was succeeded as the superior by one Joseph Auran. The second group, known as the Fathers of the Faith of Jesus, was founded in Italy in 1797 by one Niccolo Pacalani. Its members too looked to the restoration of the Jesuits and planned to join them. With papal encouragement, these two groups amalgamated in 1799, and Paganali, as their first superior, they now called themselves Fathers of the Faith. Paganari, however, proved a divisive figure, ended up twice in papal prison, and eventually in 1804, Joseph Auran, along with other like-minded priests, broke away to form their own society in France. They retained the name Fathers of Faith and led an extraordinary, fruitful apostolic life until the Restoration. At that point, they almost all entered the Society of Jesus. So if you look at that argument, it's not simply a case that they all disappeared or died with the suppression. They lived on in terms of the physical priests, but also those who wanted to emulate and recreate the order were a recurring fact during the French Revolutionary period, so that being 1789 until really 1814, 1815. The difference is, of course, is that the Society of Jesus were a vast world-spanning order. And so you have the individuals, you have the desire, you have the credo, and you have the momentum to counter the French Revolution, but you do not have the organization and you do not have the institutional backing. I think it'll be a more interesting question really to ask, because of course I've been focusing a lot on France for this conversation because that's my area of comparative expertise in Austria. But a very interesting question would be is how much the suppression of the Jesuits actually contributed to the desacralization of the Bourbon monarchy in Spain, and how much the suppression of the Jesuits actually facilitated, first of all, in the Spanish forming their alliance with Napoleon, and second of all, for the Spanish monarchy to be in that right situation where Napoleon's usurpation at Bayonne was even possible. So the society's dissolution throughout the French Revolution, I think, has a lot of devastating causes. Again, perhaps another indication of this is the suppression of the society in Bavaria could have, again, speculating, this is delving deep into counterfactuals, had a bearing on its allegiance during the French Revolutionary Wars. For reference, Bavaria was a stalwart ally of the French up until Leipzig in 1813. But then again, you have to preface that with the knowledge that the Bavarians and the French were invariably allies for most of their recent history. So, what really to take away from the society? You can say, again, it has a brief happy ending, but I think, as was actually alluded to via a different line of argumentation with Alfaro, the Jesuits did not come back in the Restoration era to fulfill the role that they had during the Tridentine Reform, which is a reification of the Catholic Universalist idea of Christendom, the Pope as its head. As I basically, my analogy was the Jesuits looking to the Pope as the Cyrus figure, and all of Europe's monarchs effectively as their satrapies. And in terms of expanding this, as the Persian Empire was the first world empire, so the Portuguese and the Spanish empires were expanding, so the Jesuits were conceiving of whole new worlds in order to create as satrapies for the Pope, being Japan and China, and of course the vast Jesuit possessions and influence over the Indies. You know, you look at that and you look at the golden age of the Jesuits and the 19th century for, you know, the Catholic monarchs and tradition. It's a series of defeats, not just for the Jesuits, it was also a series of defeats for the Christian monarchs. And so what ideology basically remains at the end of the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century, is that of statism. And whatever internationalism, which is the modernist interpretation basically of homonoia, the unity of mankind as conceived of essentially, but all concordia, as we see with organizations like the Jesuits, is instead replaced by theories such as, you know, international communism, socialism, and indeed the idea of a sort of democratic universalism and institutions, global democratic institutions in quotes, like the European Union and the United Nations. So if there is an aspect of the Jesuits sort of the political legacy of the Jesuits continuing, it is through this thoroughly displaced religious vein. As for the role that the Jesuits actually play in that, again, you can perhaps infer yourselves my views on this. All is to say is that perhaps, again, they do perform a similar role as they once did, albeit in service of what I have just stated. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. It was quite a sort of intellectually involved discussion, at least from my part. A lot of angles from which to cover. It's certainly a conversation that I find a topic that I find very interesting. And again, perhaps something which I think deserves more attention in terms of looking at the events leading up to the French Revolution, especially given that you can see this as a religious feud for the soul of France between elements of Catholicism, and how the Catholic religion in France in many ways broke down before the French Revolution, which is why for a brief time Catholicism was effectively banished from France. All right. Ambivalent teacher, for $7 Canadian, thank you. I want to say in general, ambivalent teacher, when you hear this, you've been sending many super chats over the previous streams, in some cases the only super chat. So thank you very much. It's very much appreciated. And on that vein, you just say, can't listen live, so we'll only say looks like another excellent stream. Well, hopefully when you do encounter the stream, you do indeed enjoy it. Thank you very much. Yes, Scientology is clearly the intellectual successor to this stream. I'm sure that would be interesting, I have to admit. I have a lot to say about L. Ron Hubbard. The Hub could be fun, but I don't think really I'm the one to talk about it. I think there are a lot of people far better qualified to talk about Hubbard than I am. I also think that the Jesuits are far less litigious than the Scientologists as well, so I think it's much easier to give these rather cryptic statements about them than it would to have a more overt statement on my views on the Scientologists, but there we are. Thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you again soon. Good night.